There is something about the end of the world that just makes a good story. And Fallout has been telling that story for almost 30 years now. Across 6 mainline games, hundreds of hours of terminal logs and environmental storytelling, companion dialogue, loading screen tips, in-game books, and now a live-action television series that took the whole mythology and gave it a face and a heartbeat, the world of Fallout has grown into one of the most layered, complicated, and quietly haunting fictional universes ever constructed. Every rusted tin can has a history. Every collapsed building used to mean something to someone. Every skeleton slumped against a wall was a person with a name, a family, and a morning routine that got interrupted on a specific Tuesday in October of 2077, and never resumed. Tonight we are going to go deep into all of it. The theories, the lore, the mysteries that have kept players awake at 3 in the morning scouring wiki pages and old forum threads for decades. Who started the war? What Vault-Tec was really building down in those gleaming underground bunkers? Whether the things that walk around in those irradiated wastes are still people or something else entirely? Whether any of it could have gone differently? Whether the people who tried to control everything, the ones who sat in boardrooms and military bases and shadow government facilities with access codes and evacuation plans, were ever as smart as they thought they were, or whether they were just ordinary human beings with more resources and less oversight than was healthy? We will take it slow. There is no rush here. The wasteland has been sitting there for 200 years and it is not going anywhere. So get comfortable. Let your breathing settle. Loosen whatever needs loosening. Let your thoughts drift toward a world made of dust and memory and the stubborn persistence of people who, by any reasonable calculation, should have given up long before they did. Let the questions settle over you like dust on the long highway between here and New Vegas. Let us start at the very beginning. Or rather, at the very end. Part 1, The Great War, and the question nobody can fully answer. The 23rd of October, 2077. That is the date everything ended. That is the day the bombs fell, the skies burned, and the world as anyone had known it simply stopped. But here is the thing about that date that has haunted Fallout fans since the very first game came out in 1997. Nobody, at least in the original lore, actually knew who fired first. The Fallout Bible, the unofficial lore document written by original developer Chris Avellone, states it plainly. Quote, "Bombs are launched. Who struck first is unknown. It is not even known if the bombs came from China or America." That line sat in the background of the franchise for years, and it became one of the most compelling open mysteries in gaming, because in a world built on retro-futuristic Americana, on propaganda posters and smiling faces and the kind of aggressive optimism that papers over something deeply wrong underneath, the question of who ended civilization was never meant to have an easy answer. The world of Fallout diverged from ours sometime in the 1950s. History took a different path. The Cold War never thawed. Petroleum became the lifeblood of civilization, and then it started running out. By the 2050s, the United States and China were locked in a grinding resource war, and by 2066, Chinese forces had invaded Alaska to seize the oil reserves there. Operation Anchorage, explored in the Fallout 3 downloadable expansion, shows that conflict directly. It was brutal. It was cold. It was the kind of war where both sides were running on fumes and spite. By the time the 2070s arrived, the situation had deteriorated to a point that nobody on either side was willing to say out loud. The United States had been secretly developing something called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, which we will spend a great deal of time on later, but the short version is this. It was a biological weapon powerful enough to end the species. And according to Fallout's co-creator Tim Kaine, in an interview given in late 2023 to YouTuber TK's Mantis, China found out. Kaine's explanation is one of the clearest statements ever made by someone who was actually in the room when Fallout was designed. He said the reason the nukes came was that bioweapons were illegal, and somehow China discovered the United States was developing FEV. China demanded the Americans stop. America said it would stop. And then it just moved the program somewhere else instead of actually stopping it. Kaine described it as exactly the kind of thing a desperate, cornered government would do. Not evil in a cartoonish way. Just profoundly, banally dishonest. Unable to admit what it was doing, even to its own people. So China, facing a superpower that had just lied to its face about a biological weapon capable of rewriting human DNA, made its own terrible decision. It launched the first strike. That explanation felt satisfying to a lot of people. It had the right Fallout flavor. Two superpowers behaving badly, one slightly worse than the other, and the whole planet paying the price for a series of decisions that nobody in power was willing to own up to. It was not the story of a monster pushing a button. It was the story of institutional cowardice, escalating paranoia, and a complete inability to stop a process that had already developed its own momentum. But then the Fallout television series complicated everything. The Amazon Prime series, which Bethesda director Todd Howard confirmed as canon to the franchise, introduced a different answer. And it might be the most unsettling one yet. Because according to what the show reveals, the party that dropped the first nuclear bombs was not China, and it was not the United States government. It was Vault-Tec. Think about what that means for a moment. Vault-Tec was a corporation, a private company that had been contracted by the United States government to build underground shelters capable of protecting the population during a nuclear war. They built the vaults, they designed the experiments, they staffed the positions. And according to the television show, they also sat in a room with the other major pre-war corporations, looked at the geopolitical situation, decided that civilizational collapse was inevitable, and concluded that the logical thing to do was to make sure it happened on a schedule that suited their interests. In the show, the major pre-war megacorporations had essentially become the true power in America. Vault-Tec, Robco, General Atomics, and others. They had more resources than some nations. They had private security forces. They had political influence that made elected government feel increasingly decorative. And when one of them decided it was time to trigger the apocalypse so they could control what came after it, nobody was in a position to say no. There is something deeply, specifically American about that idea. Not a foreign enemy starting the war, not even the government in some sinister mustache-twirling mode. Just a corporation doing a cost-benefit analysis and deciding that the end of civilization was a growth opportunity. The show's answer and Tim Kane's answer do not necessarily contradict each other. Vault-Tec could have fired first, and China may well have been the first national government to launch its weapons. The sequence matters less than the mechanism. What the show adds is a layer of corporate culpability that makes the whole thing even more depressing, and Fallout has always been at its best when it is doing that particular flavor of depressing. What makes this mystery so enduring is not just the factual question of which missile crossed which airspace first. It is the underlying question about what kind of world produces that outcome. The Fallout universe spent decades before the bombs fell, building a society that looked cheerful on the surface and was absolutely hollow underneath. People were told their government was protecting them. Corporations told them the same thing. Scientists told themselves they were doing necessary work. Soldiers told themselves they were following legitimate orders. And everyone was lying. At least a little bit. At least to themselves. The Great War is not the story of a villain. It is the story of a world in which everyone was so committed to their own version of the truth that nobody could see the one coming toward them at the speed of sound. The sirens went off on the 23rd of October 2077. Most people thought it was a drill. They thought it was a false alarm. They had heard the sirens before and nothing had happened. And the human brain is not built to hold genuine apocalyptic fear as a constant state. So they stood on their porches and looked at the sky and waited to be told it was fine. It was not fine. 200 years later, the people who survived in the vaults and the people who survived on the surface are still trying to figure out what happened. They are still arguing about who is to blame. They are still repeating the same patterns that led to the bombs in the first place, building hierarchies and empires and fighting over scraps. And somewhere in the ruins, there is always a terminal log from before the war, written by someone who could see exactly where it was all going but had no idea how to stop it. That is the real ghost story underneath the Fallout universe. Not the monsters, the paperwork. The deeper you go into the pre-war lore, the more the world of Fallout starts to feel less like science fiction and more like an alternate history that is uncomfortably close to patterns recognizable in our own. The resource wars were not a fantasy of foreign aggression. They were the logical endpoint of an economic system that had been built on finite resources and that lacked any serious mechanism for transitioning to alternatives when those resources ran low. The United States in Fallout's universe did not lack the intelligence to see that petroleum was running out. It lacked the political will and the institutional capacity to do anything about it before the consequences became catastrophic. The Sino-American War that resulted, and specifically the annexation of Canada that preceded the Alaska Campaign, represents a specific kind of imperial logic that the games never pretend was unique to the Fallout universe. When a society decides that its needs justify the violation of other societies' sovereignty, it has already made the choice that made the Great War possible. The specific missiles and the specific mourning were consequences of decisions made years and decades earlier, decisions that felt reasonable at each individual step. What the Fallout franchise is doing with its Great War origin mystery is something quite specific about the limits of accountability in systems of sufficient complexity. In a system with enough moving parts and enough institutional players and enough classified information, the question of who is responsible for a catastrophe may not have a clean answer. Not because no one made bad decisions, but because so many people made so many bad decisions that the question of origin dissolves into a picture of collective failure, so total that assigning primary responsibility feels almost beside the point. And yet, assigning responsibility matters. Understanding who did what and why is how societies learn from their failures. The Fallout universe's residents, 200 years after the fact, are largely unable to do this. The records that survived are incomplete and sometimes deliberately misleading. The institutions that might have maintained honest accounting were either destroyed in the war or are the ones with the most interest in controlling what the surviving accounts say. The Brotherhood of Steel has one version of pre-war history. The Enclave remnants have another. The NCR has constructed a narrative that serves its own legitimacy. The independent scholars and archivists who try to piece together something more honest are working with fragments in a landscape where the incentives for distortion are significant and the consequences for honesty are often severe. That is, in the end, perhaps the most quietly horrifying thing the Great War represents in Fallout's universe. Not the explosion, not the 2 hours of fire, but the 200 years of subsequent inability to fully account for what happened. The way that the destruction of the old world's record-keeping capacity created a vacuum that was filled by competing mythologies, each tailored to serve the interests of the group maintaining it. The truth about the 23rd of October 2077 is available somewhere in the wasteland, in terminals that have not been found, and documents that have not been read, and memories that died with the people who held them. But it may never be fully assembled. And the civilizations being built on top of that absence will keep inheriting the distorted versions of the past that are available to them, and will keep making decisions shaped by those distortions. History is the story we tell about where we came from. The Wasteland's history is a story told by survivors about a catastrophe they mostly did not witness firsthand, drawing on records maintained by institutions with interests, filtered through 2 centuries of cultural drift and deliberate revision. The Great War is not just the thing that ended the old world. It is the thing that made honest reckoning with the old world nearly impossible, which may have been, for some of the people who planned it, part of the point. Before we move on, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. And if you are new here and you want more deep dives like this, the subscribe button is right there. It costs nothing and it means a lot. Part 2. The Vaults and what Vault-Tec was actually building. Let us talk about the vaults. On the surface, the pitch was simple and almost moving in its earnestness. America is headed toward nuclear war. The government, working with Vault-Tec Corporation, has built a series of massive underground shelters. Each one can house hundreds of people. They have air filtration, food production, water purification, and enough space to maintain a community for as long as it takes for the surface to become safe again. Sign up now. Protect your family. Be one of the lucky ones. The propaganda around the vaults was some of the most effective in Fallout's pre-war world. Vault Boy, that smiling cartoon figure giving an enthusiastic thumbs up, appeared on everything. The marketing was warm and optimistic and slightly condescending in the way that all safety campaigns tend to be, the way they assume you need to be cajoled into caring about your own survival, because the reality is too frightening to confront directly. People signed up. Millions of people wanted to be included. There were more applicants than spots in most vaults, which meant a selection process, which meant that the people inside already felt chosen, already felt like the ones who had been smart enough or lucky enough to secure their family's future. And then the bombs fell, and the vault doors sealed, and the experiments began. Because here is what Vault-Tec did not put in the brochure. The vaults were not primarily shelters, they were laboratories. According to information spread across terminal logs, government documents, and declassified records scattered across every Fallout game, the actual purpose of the vaults was to conduct social and psychological experiments on the inhabitants without their knowledge or consent, in order to gather data for the Enclave's long-term plans for controlling post-war civilization. The idea was first introduced in Fallout 2's development, and Tim Kaine described the logic of it clearly. What do you do with a vault beyond just saving some people and releasing them into a radioactive dead zone? You give the whole thing a purpose. The Enclave, the shadow government that was the real power behind the United States, was not just planning to survive the war, they were planning to come back afterward and rule whatever was left. But to do that, they needed data. They needed to understand how people behave under total control, under resource scarcity, under psychological pressure, under conditions of complete isolation and manufactured threat. The vaults were the apparatus for collecting all of that. The scope of it, when you lay out vault after vault and look at what was happening inside each one, is breathtaking in its cruelty. Vault 11 told its inhabitants that one of them had to be sacrificed every year or the vault would be destroyed. The threat was completely fabricated. There was no mechanism that would destroy the vault if they refused. The entire experiment was about measuring how long a community would continue performing ritual murder based on a lie they had been told by an authority they trusted. The answer, disturbing and somehow not surprising, was a very long time. The population of Vault 11 killed each other for years before a small group finally refused. When the Vault's computer informed them they had passed the test, most of the survivors took their own lives anyway, unable to process what they had participated in. Vault 81 was designed as a medical laboratory. Residents were supposed to be exposed to every known disease through the air and water systems, and the Vault's assigned scientist was meant to use them as unwitting test subjects to develop cures. The researcher assigned to this task experienced what the clinical paperwork would call a crisis of conscience, and what any reasonable person would call a human being deciding they could not murder a community for science. He sabotaged most of the program. One prototype strain of mole rat disease escaped anyway and persisted in the sublevels, which is why the mole rats in that vault in Fallout 4 are infected with something that can be transferred to humans. The vault survived and remained functional precisely because the experiment failed to fully activate. Vault 87 in the Capital Wasteland did not try to be subtle. The experiment there was the Evolutionary Experimentation Program, which is a technical name for exposing Vault residents to a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus and documenting what happened to them. What happened was that they became super mutants. The failed experiments are still there, in the lower levels, in shapes that do not correspond to any clean narrative about science serving humanity. Vault 92 was full of white noise. Specifically, it was a vault whose experiment involved piping subliminal signals into the audio environment to test the possibility of triggering violent psychotic episodes in the general population. They were testing whether you could brainwash people through sound. The answer, based on what you find when you walk through that vault, appears to be yes. Vault 77 apparently housed one man and a crate of puppets. There is exactly one terminal entry about this vault, and it is from the single occupant, and it is the most deeply strange piece of writing in the entire franchise. Vault 101, which is where Fallout 3 begins, had an experiment built around a single premise. The vault door would never open. Not until the resources ran out, not until a generation had been born and died without ever seeing sunlight. The Overseer's job was to maintain the fiction that leaving was never an option, that the outside world was too dangerous to contemplate, that the vault was both prison and paradise, and the people inside should be grateful for it. The fact that the player character eventually escapes is presented as a profound act of rebellion, but what makes it haunting is how many people inside that vault never even considered the idea that there might be a choice to make. There were control vaults too. Vaults that actually did what they said they would do, with no sinister experiment layered on top. These existed to provide baseline data, a comparison group for all the experiments happening everywhere else. Vault 8 in New Vegas lore was one of these. It received the all-clear signal shortly after the war, and its residents emerged to build the city of Vault City, which then developed its own deeply complicated politics about who counted as a real person and who was just an outsider. The control vault worked exactly as advertised, and it still produced a society with serious problems. That detail seems intentional. The thing that makes the Vault conspiracy genuinely disturbing rather than just evil in an abstract way is how completely it depended on trust. People trusted the government to have their interests at heart. People trusted corporations to build the things they said they built. People trusted the Overseer because the Overseer was the authority figure, and the Vault was the whole world. Every layer of the experiment relied on the subjects never knowing they were subjects. Every manipulated election, every manufactured scarcity, every fabricated emergency was only effective as long as the people inside believed they were living in a shelter, rather than a cage, designed to study how long they would last before they broke. In Fallout's world, that trust was total, which is why its betrayal was so complete. The vaults are the franchise's central metaphor, and it is not a subtle one. They are a comment on the relationship between populations and the institutions that claim to protect them. They are asking what happens when the apparatus built to save you was actually designed to study you. And they keep asking that question across every game because the answer never gets more comfortable, no matter how many times you look at it. 200 years after the bombs fell, people are still stumbling into sealed vaults and reading the terminal logs and putting together what happened. And every time they do, the same basic realization surfaces. The people running the show were never protecting anyone. They were running an experiment, and the experiment was you. The control vault concept deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is the element of the vault program that most clearly demonstrates the scope of what was being attempted. A control vault was one that actually did what the brochure said, housed its population, maintained life support, and waited for conditions to improve on the surface. The data collected from control vaults was used as a baseline, a comparison point against which the results from experimental vaults could be measured. But here's what makes the control vaults philosophically complicated. Even in vaults that had no imposed experiment, no manufactured crisis, no deliberately introduced stress, the communities that developed inside them still produced significant social problems. Vault City, the community built by Vault 8's residents after they emerged, became one of the most insular and discriminatory settlements in the Western Wasteland. Citizens of Vault City had legal protections and access to advanced medical technology. Non-citizens, the outsiders who lived in the surrounding shantytown, had neither and were treated with contempt that occasionally crossed into active cruelty. The vault that had the most benign experiment of all, which was no experiment, produced a society that replicated some of the worst features of the pre-war world. The implication of this is significant. The vault program's failures were not purely the result of the specific cruelties introduced by the experiments. They were also the result of the vault's basic design: sealed communities with fixed hierarchies, limited resources, and no external accountability. Those structural features produced bad outcomes even without additional manufactured stress. The experiment was, in some ways, unnecessary. The basic architecture of total institutional control was already sufficient to produce the kinds of social dysfunction the Enclave was interested in studying. That realization connects to one of the franchise's deepest themes. The problem with the pre-war world was not just the specific bad actors who made specific bad decisions. It was the structures that concentrated power and removed accountability that allowed those specific bad actors to exist and to act without effective check. The vaults reproduced those structural features in miniature and then documented what happened. What happened was largely what you would expect from the structural features, regardless of whether there was an additional intentional experiment running. Vault 21 in New Vegas is a particularly interesting case. Its experiment was a simple one. All disputes, including property rights and who got to live in the vault, would be resolved by gambling. On its face, this sounds almost whimsical. In practice, it meant that the vault's resources accumulated over time in the hands of whoever was most skilled at or lucky in gambling, and that the people least skilled at it progressively lost access to food and medicine and living space. It was, in other words, an experiment in unfettered market dynamics, with the added honesty of making the mechanism visible rather than obscuring it behind the usual institutional language about meritocracy and natural outcomes. Mr. House, who eventually won the strip from the vault's residents by winning a 21-year gambling streak, understood this perfectly. He was not simply a skilled gambler. He had built a system that gave him structural advantages in every game the vault played. The vault's experiment was meant to test whether gambling could serve as a social organizing principle. What it produced, predictably, was a demonstration that any system with sufficiently unequal access to resources tends to produce outcomes that favor whoever started with the most advantages, regardless of the ostensible fairness of the rules governing individual transactions. The vaults, when you lay them all out, are a collection of social science experiments that consistently produce the same basic finding. When you remove accountability, when you seal people into a system with no exit and limited recourse against abuse of authority, When you create conditions of scarcity and then observe how the resulting competition for resources plays out, you get outcomes that the people who designed the vaults would have recognized as data and that the people living inside them experienced as their whole world. The gap between those two perspectives is the vault program's specific cruelty. The experiment's success required that the subjects not know they were subjects. The knowledge that would have made them able to resist was the knowledge the whole apparatus was designed to prevent them from having. The relationship between the Enclave and Vault-Tec, played out through the Vault program over 2 centuries, is actually more complex than a simple boss-contractor relationship. The Vaults were not running on Vault-Tec's initiative and the Enclave's agenda separately. They were the same agenda, with Vault-Tec as the public face of a program the Enclave needed to maintain plausible civilian framing. The corporation gave the program legitimacy. People could understand and accept the Vault as a product, as something a company would build for profit in a time of existential anxiety, in ways they might not have accepted a straightforwardly governmental survival program. Vault-Tec's marketing genius, from the Enclave's perspective, was making the Vault system feel like the natural thing for a responsible citizen to want. Not a government imposition, but a consumer choice. Not compulsion, but selection. The fact that far more people wanted Vault spaces than there were spaces available was not a failure of planning. It was the system working correctly. It created a situation where being selected for a Vault felt like a reward, like validation of your worth, and being excluded felt like a judgment rather than a policy decision. The people who made it in felt grateful and chosen. The people who did not made no coordinated complaint because they had been socially defined as the unselected, which in the pre-war America of the Fallout universe carried its own freight of shame. The Overseer system is worth examining in this context. Each Vault had an Overseer, a single authority figure responsible for maintaining order and executing Vault-Tec's directives. The Overseer's power was essentially absolute within the Vault. They controlled information flow, administered discipline, made resource allocation decisions, and were the primary interpreter of what the Vault's rules required. The position was hereditary in some Vaults, institutional in others, electoral in a few. But in all cases, the Overseer was the connection point between the inhabitants' experience and the experiment's design. The Overseer of Vault 101, the one the player character grew up under in Fallout 3, represents one of the most complete portraits of what institutional authority looks like when it has been designed to be self-perpetuating. He is not simply power-hungry. He genuinely believes in the Vault's mission, which he understands as keeping everyone safe by keeping everyone inside. His restrictions, the rules against contact with the outside, the penalties for attempting to leave, the systematic discouragement of curiosity about the surface, are all, in his understanding, protective rather than oppressive. He is the most sincere possible representative of an institution built on a lie. He believes the lie completely, and his belief makes him an effective instrument of it. The player character's father, who leaves the Vault at the beginning of Fallout 3, is the character who breaks the institution's spell. Not through dramatic revelation, but through the simple act of leaving. The door opened. Someone walked out. That fact is not supposed to be possible, and the fact that it happened anyway reveals the void at the center of the Overseer's authority. The rules only work if nobody tests them. Once someone tests them and the consequences are not what the rules threatened, the rules have been exposed as management tools rather than laws of nature. The Vault program's legacy in the Wasteland is not just the experiments themselves, it is the psychological architecture those experiments built. The people who emerged from Vaults, after generations of being sealed in institutions of total control, carry specific patterns of thought about authority and obedience and the relationship between safety and constraint. Those patterns interact with the very different psychology produced by surface survival, where authority is diffuse, where obedience to bad authority gets you killed, where adaptability is the primary survival tool. The meeting of Vault psychology and surface psychology produces many of the most interesting social dynamics in the franchise, particularly in communities like Megaton and Diamond City and the Hub, where the two cultures are in sustained contact. Part 3. The Fev, the Master, and the Army, built on a broken dream. The forced evolutionary virus began as a solution to a medical problem. In the 2050s, a disease called the New Plague was spreading through the United States. It was new, it was fast, and conventional medicine was struggling to respond to it. West Tech Corporation's NBC division, which stood for Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical, was tasked with finding an answer. What they came up with was a synthetic retrovirus that could correct errors in human DNA. The idea was that if you could rewrite the genetic code precisely enough, you could effectively engineer immunity to any disease. The Pan-Immunity Virion Project was born, and for a while, it looked like genuine science fiction applied to a genuine problem. Then the military got involved, and things took the turn they always take when the military gets involved with something that rewrites genetic code. By 2073, the research had moved from medical applications towards something much larger. If a virus could correct damaged DNA and create disease immunity, what else could it do? Could it increase muscle mass? Could it improve cognitive function? Could it produce the kind of soldier who did not need to eat as much, who healed faster, who could withstand conditions that would kill an ordinary person? The answer, based on the experiments that followed, was yes. It could do all of those things. It could also do several other things nobody had planned for, and those unplanned effects were catastrophic. By 2076, West Tech had moved its operations to the Mariposa military base in California, and the experiments had shifted to human subjects. These were not volunteers. They were military prisoners, people who had no recourse and no knowledge of what was being injected into them. The results were documented in careful clinical language and terminal logs that you can read in Fallout 1, and the gap between the language and what it describes is one of the most unsettling things in the franchise. Everything reads like a competent, professional researcher cataloging outcomes. The outcomes include people transforming into creatures that no longer resemble what they were before the VATS. The FEV, when administered to an adult human who had already been exposed to background radiation from the pre-war environment, did not create a super soldier. It created something bigger, significantly stronger, and almost entirely stripped of intelligence. The mutation was unpredictable in precisely the ways that made it useless for the military's purposes. You could not give complex orders to something that could barely form complex thoughts. The experiment was, by any operational military measure, a failure. But then the war happened, and one man survived who had been exposed to the FEV, and he had something that most of the human test subjects had not had. He had been in a relatively clean environment before exposure, which meant the virus interacted with his DNA in a fundamentally different way. His name was Richard Gray, and his transformation into the character known as the Master is one of the most tragic origin stories in the franchise. Gray was a wanderer, someone exploring the post-war California wasteland shortly after the bombs fell. He made his way to Mariposa military base in 2102, roughly 25 years after the Great War. He found the FEV VATS, and whether through accident or something closer to a compulsion born out of scientific curiosity, he was exposed to the virus in the most concentrated way possible. He fell into the VATS themselves. He survived. And what came out was not Richard Gray anymore. The transformation took months. Gray's body mutated dramatically, but his mind did something different. Instead of collapsing into the kind of low-functioning brutality that characterized most FEV mutations, Gray's consciousness expanded. He developed a neurolink into the base's computer systems. He began to process information at a speed and volume that no human brain was ever designed to handle. He learned everything about the FEV, everything about the pre-war program, everything about what the virus had been designed to do and what it had actually done. And then he started building his vision. The Master, as he came to be known, had a philosophy that started from a real place. The problem with humanity as he diagnosed it was division. War, tribalism, competition for resources, the inability to cooperate at sufficient scale to solve the problems cooperation was the only solution to. These were real observations about the world that had just ended in nuclear fire. The conclusion he drew from them was that forced unification was the answer. One species, one purpose, one direction. The unity was what he called his movement, and the mechanism for achieving it was forcing every human being on Earth through the FEV VATS. Super mutants, in the Master's vision, were the next stage of human evolution. Stronger, disease-resistant, unified under a single ideology. The conflict that had destroyed civilization would be impossible once everyone shared the same biology. The petty differences that humans used to justify killing each other would have no foundation. It was, at its core, a totalitarian philosophy with a biological delivery mechanism, and the Master believed in it with complete sincerity. Here is the thing about the Master that makes him one of Fallout's most interesting villains. He was wrong, and he knew it, and the player character of the first game can prove it to him. The Master did not know that humans who had lived in the post-war environment long enough had been exposed to ambient FEV through the air and water. That exposure, while not enough to trigger mutation, was enough to inoculate them against the full effects of intentional FEV exposure, which meant that when the Master put these wastelanders through his vats, they did not transform into super mutants. They died. They died messily and incompletely. Their bodies unable to handle a virus their systems were already partially fighting. The Master's army could not reproduce and could not recruit efficiently because the population he was most easily able to seize were exactly the people least likely to survive the process. And then there was the sterility issue. Super mutants, it turned out, were completely infertile. The FEV transformation was total enough to render reproductive biology non-functional. An army of super mutants could not produce the next generation of super mutants through any means other than continued vat exposure. The Unity was not a sustainable future for the species. It was a one-generation solution that would lead to extinction once the last human had been converted or killed. When the Vault Dweller, the player character of Fallout 1, presents this evidence to the Master directly, something extraordinary happens. The Master, this entity that has lived for decades in a fusion of biological tissue and computer systems, that has built an army and a religion and a philosophy, stops. He thinks. And then he acknowledges that he was wrong. He then destroys himself and dismantles his own army by removing the key figure holding everything together. That moment is unlike almost anything in gaming. A villain who can be defeated not through violence but through logic. A monster who still has enough of the human left inside to recognize when he has been shown something true, and to respond to that truth honestly even though it means the end of everything he built. The Master is horrifying and tragic, and somehow in the end, more decent than most of the institutions that created the conditions for him to exist. The FEV itself went on causing problems long after the Master was gone. The Enclave picked up strains of it and modified them into biological weapons. The Institute used a version of it in their synth research. Remnants of the original experiments persisted in the Mariposa vats, and anyone who went too close to them encountered the same unpredictable results that had been documented in clinical language in the pre-war terminals. And across the wastelands of America, the super mutants that survived the collapse of the Master's army made their own lives. Some of them formed communities. Some of them continued the Master's methods on a smaller scale, running their own conversion programs. Some of them, particularly on the East Coast, deteriorated over time into the inarticulate brutes the FEV had created in the original Mariposa vats. But others held on to intelligence, onto culture, onto something that might cautiously be called wisdom, if wisdom can survive a process that fundamentally remakes everything you are. The FEV is Fallout's most persistent symbol for what happens when science is pointed at human beings without ethical constraint. It was designed to save people. It ended up being used to create weapons, to conduct unconsented experiments on prisoners, and to fuel a messianic ideology that tried to eliminate human diversity by force. Every step of that journey made sense in its own local logic. Each decision followed from the one before it. Nobody sat down and decided to make a virus that would reshape the human species into something unrecognizable. They just kept making the next reasonable-seeming choice until the reasonable-seeming choices had produced something monstrous. That is, of course, the story Fallout tells over and over again. Not villainy, just the accumulation of reasonable-seeming choices. The Master's specific genius and the specific nature of his failure comes into focus most clearly when you examine the timeline of his movement. He spent years building something that, from the outside, looked like a war machine, an army of super mutants advancing on vault populations in California, a network of operations spreading across the wasteland, a religious movement called the Children of the Cathedral, providing a civilian face to what was essentially a military campaign. From the inside, it was something that the Master himself experienced as salvation. He was not conquering. He was converting. He was not eliminating human civilization. He was transforming it into something that, in his vision, would be free from the specific weakness that had destroyed it. The Master's tragedy is not that he was evil. It is that he was right about the problem and catastrophically wrong about the solution. And he was wrong in a way that he could not see until someone showed him the evidence. His diagnostic capacity was real. His therapeutic capacity was built on a false premise, and the false premise was so fundamental to the entire structure of the Unity that when it collapsed, the whole edifice came down with it. What the Vault Dweller of Fallout 1 does, in the conversation that ends the Master as a viable force, is essentially present a medical diagnosis. The Unity cannot achieve its goals because its mechanism is biologically incapable of producing the intended outcome. Supermutants cannot reproduce. The humans most available for conversion are the least suitable for it. The plan, executed fully, would produce a generation of supermutants and then nothing further, because there would be no second generation and no viable pool of converts remaining. The Master's response to this diagnosis is the thing that makes the original Fallout one of the most remarkable games ever made. He does not argue. He does not dismiss the evidence. He sits with it, this being that has been running a continent-spanning military and religious operation for years, and he allows himself to genuinely reconsider. And then he acts on the reconsideration in the most complete way available to him. It is worth pausing on what that response required of him. The Master had built an identity around the Unity. He had built a community around it, thousands of super mutants and human followers who believed in the vision he had articulated. He had spent years justifying every atrocity the movement had committed by reference to the rightness of the goal. The evidence the Vault Dweller presented did not just undermine a tactical plan. It undermined the entire framework of meaning that the Master had constructed over decades of existence. To accept the evidence meant accepting that the atrocities had served nothing. That the people converted and killed and displaced in the name of the Unity had suffered for a fantasy built on a false premise. Most people, faced with that kind of evidence, do not simply accept it. They argue, they reframe, they find ways to maintain the core belief while accommodating the troubling data at the margins. The Master did not do this. He accepted it and acted on it, and in doing so demonstrated that whatever he had become, over those years in the vats and the decades of planning and executing the Unity, he had retained something that the process should arguably have burned away. Something that recognized an obligation to honesty that exceeded the obligation to self-preservation. The FEV's effects on the creatures of the wasteland are another thread worth following. The virus, once released into the environment through the Mariposa vats and through subsequent experiments, did not stay contained to deliberately infected subjects. It dispersed. It contaminated the water and the soil, and eventually the air at low concentrations. Animals and insects and plants that were exposed to these ambient concentrations over years and generations accumulated changes. The Deathclaw, for instance, was a pre-war experiment, a Jackson's chameleon modified with FEV and released as a weapon. By the time of the games, Deathclaws have been living in the wild and breeding for 2 centuries, and the FEV-enhanced traits have become fixed in the species. The creature that Benny uses as a threat early in New Vegas is the biological legacy of a pre-war weapons program, living wild and reproducing and becoming something its creators never imagined because they never had to live with the consequences of what they made. The mole rats, the rad scorpions, the rad roaches, the various mutated plants and animals that populate the wasteland are all, in varying degrees, consequences of the same phenomenon. The environment the Great War created was not just radioactive. It was biologically altered in ways that produced ongoing change rather than a simple new equilibrium. The wasteland is not a static post-apocalyptic landscape. It is a world in the middle of an ecological transformation whose endpoint nobody can predict because the FEV and the radiation are continuing to interact with the biological diversity of the continent in ways that produce new results with each generation. That ongoing transformation is one of the things that makes the Fallout universe feel genuinely alive, rather than just post-apocalyptic wallpaper. The world is still changing, the creatures evolving, the plants adapting. Something is being built out of the wreckage, even if what is being built was not planned and does not resemble anything that existed before. The supermutants of the Capital Wasteland, encountered extensively in Fallout 3, deserve their own consideration as a study in what FEV produces when it operates through institutional channels rather than through the Master's relatively intentional program. The Vault 87 supermutants were created by a variant of the FEV delivered not through a charismatic leader's conversion operation, but through an automated vault system implementing a standing protocol. Nobody was there making individual decisions about who went into the vats. The evolutionary experimentation program was designed to run without sustained human oversight, and it did. The super mutants it produced, larger and less intelligent than the Master's relatively refined creations, had no ideological framework given to them by their creator. They just were, in the post-war world, needing to make sense of what they were. The specific culture that Capital Wasteland's supermutants developed, the raiding and the violence, and the specific contempt for humans that characterizes their in-game behavior is what you get when a population is created through trauma and then abandoned to figure out its own meaning. The Master's supermutants had the unity, they had a theology and a purpose and a leader who, for all his monstrousness, gave them a framework for understanding themselves. The Vault 87 supermutants have none of that. They know what they are in the narrow biological sense, and they know that the human communities around them fear and reject them, and their response to that rejection has been largely to fulfill the role that rejection defines for them. Fox, the companion encountered in Vault 87, is the exceptional case that illuminates the pattern by contrast. He has had extended time in isolation with access to books and records, and the opportunity for genuine reflection on his situation. He has developed a philosophy and a personality and a genuine ethical framework. He is, in the terms the franchise establishes, exactly what a supermutant could be if given the conditions for that development. The fact that those conditions are so rarely present for the Capital Wasteland supermutants, that the conditions most of them actually have are conditions of violence and rejection, and the specific kind of social poverty that comes from being categorically excluded, tells you what the franchise thinks about the relationship between environment and character. Marcus, the supermutant mayor encountered in Fallout 2 and referenced in New Vegas, is another data point in the same argument. He has built a career and a community and a practical philosophy across decades of post-war life, developing into something that would be recognizable as wisdom if encountered in a less alarming body. His relationship with the Wasteland's human communities is characterized by a patient, somewhat sardonic acceptance of the fact that those communities will rarely engage with him as fully as he deserves. He has made his peace with the limits of what the world will allow him to be, and he has found something worth doing within those limits. The question of whether supermutants can and should integrate into human communities is one the franchise keeps posing without resolving. The specific answer varies by context, by individual, by the specific community's conditions and history. What the franchise consistently asserts is that the categorical version of the answer, the one that says supermutants are by nature incompatible with human community, is wrong. Not because all supermutants are compatible with any specific community, but because the individuals who could be compatible exist, and their categorical exclusion is a failure of the communities doing the excluding as much as a reflection of anything inherent in the excluded. The waste of intelligence and capability that the categorical exclusion of supermutants represents? The Marcus figures and the Fox figures who could contribute significantly to the rebuilding of civilization, and who are instead forced into the margins or into the role of enemies by communities that have decided what supermutants are, before they have gotten to know who any specific super-mutant is one of the Wasteland's more specific and avoidable self-injuries. It is the kind of waste that institutional prejudice consistently produces, and the Fallout franchise is, as always, interested in documenting the specific cost of that waste rather than pretending it does not exist. Part 4. Roger Maxson and the Birth of the Brotherhood of Steel. On the 10th of October, 2077, Captain Roger Maxson learned something that changed the direction of his life and, through consequences that spread across centuries, the shape of an entire post-apocalyptic civilization. He was stationed at the Mariposa military base in California, commanding the security team assigned to protect the scientific research facility located there. He had known, in a general way, that the research was classified and sensitive. He had not known the specifics. Then something broke down in the chain of information control. The details vary across different lore documents, and Maxson and his soldiers discovered what the scientists had been doing to the military prisoners. The FEV experiments. The VATS. The transformation of human beings, without consent, without knowledge, in the name of research that the United States government had officially sanctioned, and that the soldiers standing guard over it had been kept completely in the dark about. Colonel Spindell, Maxson's commanding officer, suffered a mental breakdown and locked himself in his office. He would eventually take his own life 2 days later, unable to reconcile what his post had been in service of. That left Maxson as the de facto commander of the facility, in charge of soldiers who were screaming for blood and a situation that was teetering on the edge of uncontrolled violence. What Maxson did in that moment was something that sits in an uncomfortable moral space that Fallout never pretends is clean. He established interrogations. He brought the scientists before him and demanded answers. When the first scientist was brought forward and explained that what they had done was sanctioned by the United States government, Maxson killed him anyway. The interrogations that followed were, without exception, also executions. Every scientist at the Mariposa facility was dead by October 18th. Maxson documented this in his personal log with the kind of bleak clarity that comes from someone who has made a decision and is not going to pretend it was straightforward. He acknowledged that he was not sure if he was delivering justice or just channeling the anger of his men into something that looked like justice. The man who would become the founding father of the Brotherhood of Steel spent his last days before the apocalypse writing diary entries that read like someone trying to figure out whether they were a hero or a murderer, and finding the answer deeply inconclusive. On the 20th of October 2077, 3 days before the bombs fell, Maxson declared himself and his unit to be in full secession from the United States. He broadcast this over the radio, not expecting a response, and none came. The government was somewhat preoccupied. When the Great War happened on October 23rd, the Mariposa base survived intact. Maxson brought the families of his soldiers inside for shelter. And then, fearing that China would eventually find whatever targets it had missed in the first strike, he organized an exodus. The group walked from Mariposa across the California desert toward a government bunker at Lost Hills, and they lost people along the way to raiders and exposure and the brutal conditions of a world that had just been redesigned by nuclear fire. Maxson's wife was among the losses recorded in the Fallout Bible's account of the Exodus. When they reached Lost Hills and sealed the bunker, Maxson had the raw material of what would eventually become the Brotherhood of Steel. A group of military personnel and their families, united by shared trauma, bound by a specific shared experience of having learned something terrible and chosen to act on it, possessing a stockpile of pre-war military technology and the training to use and maintain it. The philosophy of the Brotherhood evolved over the decades and centuries after Maxson's death. His original motivation had been, in its broken way, ethical. His soldiers had been lied to by their government, used as unwitting enforcers of genuinely inhumane research, and Maxson had responded by pulling them out of the system entirely. The hoarding of pre-war technology that became central to Brotherhood culture started as practical necessity and became ideological over time. If the technology in the wrong hands could produce Mariposa, then perhaps the technology needed to be controlled by people who understood what it could do. There is something genuinely reasonable about that position, looked at from a certain angle. There is also something that slides, over generations, into exactly the kind of institutional pathology it was meant to prevent. The Brotherhood's relationship with technology evolved from stewardship to fetishism to a kind of theological reverence that elevated machinery above the people the machinery was supposedly meant to serve. The different chapters of the Brotherhood in different games represent different stages of this drift. The West Coast Brotherhood, operating out of Lost Hills and its descendants, retained more of the founding nuance, with a tendency toward isolation and self-preservation that was occasionally broken by members who remembered that the world outside the bunker also existed. The East Coast Brotherhood, which showed up in Fallout 3 under Elder Lyons, had fractures running through it because Lyons was doing something the core philosophy had lost sight of, actually trying to help the people of the Capital Wasteland, even at cost to the Brotherhood itself. His more orthodox members hated him for it. The Brotherhood in Fallout 4, under Elder Maxson, the great-great-grandson of the founder, had evolved into something that Roger Maxson might have recognized in its military discipline and its relationship to technology, but probably not in its specific contempt for both ghouls and synths as categories of beings that did not merit protection. The original Maxson had been motivated by his horror at the treatment of human beings as experimental subjects. His descendants' Brotherhood was making its own determinations about which beings qualified as human enough to matter. That particular irony runs through every appearance the Brotherhood makes across the franchise. An organization born from a man who killed a scientist for running illegal experiments on people without their consent, which then became an organization that routinely made categorical determinations about whose life had value. The distance between those two things is vast, but the road between them is made of small, reasonable-seeming steps that accumulated over 200 years without anyone stopping to ask where they were going. Roger Maxson died in 2135 of a cancer he contracted during the Resource Wars. By then, the Brotherhood of Steel was already a functioning institution, already building the traditions and hierarchies that would carry it forward. His personal journals, the ones he wrote during those days at Mariposa and in the weeks of the Exodus, were kept and studied. He was made into a founding figure, a legend, which is what societies do to complicated people when they need the history to be cleaner than it actually was. The real Roger Maxson was a man who made a choice under impossible pressure and spent the rest of his life not entirely sure it had been the right one. That uncertainty is almost entirely absent from how the Brotherhood talks about him. But it is preserved, for anyone who looks, in the terminal logs that were kept from those first terrible weeks, when a captain in the United States Army became something else entirely, in a desert base full of the consequences of science with no conscience. The Brotherhood's evolution across the games reflects a genuine ambiguity in its founding philosophy. Roger Maxson left the U.S. Army because it was doing something unconscionable. He built an organization based on that leaving, on the conviction that some things are wrong regardless of who authorizes them. And yet the Brotherhood over time became something that required leaving in exactly the same way, for exactly the same reasons, just applied to different populations. The Paladins who hunt synths in Fallout 4's Commonwealth are doing what they believe Roger Maxson would have wanted them to do. They are maintaining the Brotherhood's mission of controlling dangerous technology. They are keeping weapons out of the hands of those who would misuse them. They are the inheritors of a tradition that started with a man who found unconsented human experimentation intolerable. And they do not notice the distance between where they started and where they ended up because each individual step along the way seemed like a reasonable extension of the step before it. That is how institutions drift. Not through sudden betrayals, but through gradual accretion of reasonable-seeming extensions that collectively produce something the founders would not recognize. The Maxson bloodline is itself a fascinating study in the costs of founding mythology. Arthur Maxson, elder of the East Coast Brotherhood in Fallout 4, is a young man by the time we meet him, barely past his teenage years, carrying the weight of a name that is essentially a religious artifact in the community he leads. He was put in that position partly because of competence but significantly because of lineage, because the Brotherhood needed the continuity of the Maxson name to maintain its own sense of coherent identity across the institutional turbulence that followed Lyons' death. What that means in practice is that a young man with real intelligence and real capability is operating under enormous pressure to be the embodiment of a myth rather than a person with a developing understanding of difficult situations. Lyons' Brotherhood, which the player encounters through the character of Sarah Lyons and through the stories of what her father was trying to do, represents the path not taken. A brotherhood that oriented itself toward protecting the people of the wasteland rather than controlling the technology of the wasteland. The faction split it caused, which produced the outcasts, shows how deeply the original orthodoxy had taken root. But Lyons' deviation from that orthodoxy also shows what the brotherhood could have been, what it perhaps should have been given the conditions of its founding. An organization that remembered why it mattered that human beings were protected from having things done to them without their consent, and that applied that principle consistently rather than selectively. There is a conversation the player can have with Elder Maxson in Fallout 4 in which he articulates his vision with genuine passion and some genuine insight. He is not a fool. He understands the wasteland's complexity in ways that some of his paladins do not. He has made himself into something, through training and discipline and the very serious deployment of his considerable capabilities. But he has also made himself into something that forecloses certain kinds of growth. The certainty required to lead the Brotherhood the way he leads it is incompatible with the kind of open inquiry that might lead him to notice what his organization has become. The most interesting Brotherhood characters across the franchise are the ones at the margins, the members who are asking the questions the institution would prefer they did not ask. Dance, the Paladin companion in Fallout 4 who discovers he is a synth, the outcasts who disagree with Lyons but whose rigidity about the mission has its own problems, the scribes who preserve knowledge that the institution would sometimes rather forget. These are the people in whom the founding contradiction of the Brotherhood, we left because we found the institution intolerable, and we will not tolerate this same thing ourselves, is most alive and most painful. The question of technology, specifically of who should have it and who should decide, is the Brotherhood's central philosophical contribution to Fallout's political landscape. Every other major faction in the franchise has a position on governance, on society, on the economy. Only the Brotherhood has made technology stewardship its defining purpose, and the specific way it pursues that purpose reveals something important about the relationship between access to knowledge and access to power. The pre-war world failed, in the Brotherhood's analysis, because technology was distributed without wisdom. Anyone with resources could build or buy things that required wisdom to use safely. The free market in lethal capability that produced the FEV program, that produced the corporate weapons systems, that produced the specific arsenal of the Great War, was the failure mode that needed correction. The Brotherhood's response was to remove the free market entirely and replace it with a gatekeeping institution that would make determinations about who was qualified to have what. The deep problem with this, which the franchise documents across multiple games without always making it explicit, is that the Brotherhood's definition of qualified is self-referential. The Brotherhood determines who is qualified, and the qualification is primarily determined by being the Brotherhood. External parties who want access to technology have to get it through the Brotherhood, on the Brotherhood's terms, in exchange for acknowledging the Brotherhood's authority to set those terms. The institutional monopoly on technology judgment is maintained by the institution whose power depends on maintaining it. This is not a uniquely Brotherhood problem. Every institution that claims to be the appropriate guardian of something important faces the same structural tension. The Enclave claimed to be the appropriate guardian of genetic purity. The Institute claims to be the appropriate guardian of scientific progress. In each case, the claim of guardianship is also a claim of authority, and the claim of authority is backed by the capacity to enforce it. The difference between legitimate guardianship and illegitimate monopoly is not always visible from inside the institution making the claim. The scribes of the Brotherhood represent the most interesting internal tension in this regard. They are the people who actually work with the technology, who study it and maintain it and document it, and occasionally develop new applications for it. Their relationship with the technology is practical and intellectual rather than primarily strategic. And yet within the Brotherhood's hierarchy, the scribes are subordinate to the paladins and knights whose relationship with the technology is primarily one of capability and deployment. The people who understand what the technology does are below the people who decide what to do with it. That inversion of the expected relationship between knowledge and authority is one of the Brotherhood's most specifically bureaucratic failures. It produces situations where tactical decisions are made by people whose technical understanding is limited, while the people with the deepest technical understanding have limited input into tactical decisions. The results are predictable to anyone who has spent time in large institutions. Competence is sometimes deployed well, but is structurally unable to correct strategic errors made at levels above it. Part 5: Ghouls, Time, and the Question of What Survives. The radiation did not kill everyone who stayed on the surface. Some of them changed. The process is called ghoulification in the Fallout universe, and the biological mechanics of it, as laid out in the Fallout wiki and supported across every game in the franchise, describe something genuinely strange. Most people who are exposed to sufficient levels of radiation simply die. The cell damage accumulates too fast, the body's repair mechanisms cannot keep pace, and the outcome is what you would expect. But a small fraction of people, for reasons that appear to involve specific genetic factors that the science of the wasteland has never fully characterized, undergo something different. The radiation damages them without destroying them. It rewrites certain systems in ways that should be fatal but are not, and the result is a ghoul. Ghouls look like what you would design if you wanted something to read as dead without actually being dead. Their skin deteriorates in ways that expose the structures underneath. Their bodies become immune to the radiation that transformed them, and more than immune, they actually benefit from radiation exposure, drawing something like nutrition or healing from it. They do not age. Their bodies, once changed, maintain their current state indefinitely. The normal mechanisms of cellular degradation that make human beings mortal simply stop applying. They are, in almost every meaningful biological sense, immortal. The character of the ghoul in the Fallout television series, Cooper Howard, is explicitly stated to be over 200 years old. He was a working actor and television personality before the bombs fell, a man with a family and a career and the particular kind of comfortable life that made the approaching catastrophe seem unreal even when the evidence was right in front of him. He survived the Great War through a process the show has been deliberately vague about, and spent the next 2 centuries building the particular set of skills and the particular set of problems that a bounty hunter with a 200-year career would accumulate. That detail, 200 years as a coherent, functional person, is staggering when you sit with it. Everything Cooper knew has been gone for longer than the United States had existed when the bombs fell. Everyone he loved, everyone who knew him, every structure of meaning that made the pre-war world feel like a place worth living in, all of it dissolved by 2 centuries of radiation and scarcity and violence. The person he was in 2077 would be unrecognizable to what he became, and yet some thread of continuity persisted, something that still answered to his name and operated from something like a set of values, even if those values had been scoured down to a very hard and very simple core. The question of what happens to a person across that kind of time span is one the Fallout series handles with genuine thoughtfulness. The most important distinction in ghoul society, to whatever extent ghoul society exists, is between ghouls who maintained their mental coherence and ghouls who did not. The feral ghoul is the nightmare version. The body keeps going, but the mind degrades, slowly losing the capacity for language and planning and the kind of intentional relationship with the world that separates a person from an animal. The brain, unlike the body, is not protected from the slow erosion of time by the ghoulification process. It is still subject to the deterioration that comes from extreme age. Eventually, for most ghouls, the higher functions go. What is left continues to move through the world on instinct, which in a feral ghoul means aggression and hunger and nothing else. That is the worst fear every non-feral ghoul carries. That eventually, no matter how carefully they maintain themselves, no matter what medication or chemistry they use to slow the process, the person they currently are will not be there anymore. What is left will still be walking around, still look like them from outside, but nothing that was actually them will remain. The Fallout television series introduced a medication that can delay this process, though the exact mechanism is kept deliberately vague. Cooper Howard, as the ghoul, uses regular doses of something to maintain his coherence over centuries. The implication is that without it, he would eventually lose himself to the feral state. That turns the medicine into something that functions more like identity than healthcare. It is the thing that allows him to remain the continuous self he has been for 200 years, the thread that connects the man who told bedtime stories to his daughter in 2077 to the bounty hunter navigating the wasteland in 2296. There is a theory in the Fallout community, one that has real textual support, that the transition to the feral state is not strictly biological. Some long-lived ghouls appear to have stayed coherent without unusual access to medicine. Raul Tejada, the mechanic companion in Fallout New Vegas, is over 200 years old and has maintained his personality and intelligence through what appears to be primarily force of purpose and will. Hancock, the ghoul mayor of Goodneighbor in Fallout 4, has been a ghoul for decades and shows no signs of degradation. Jason Bright in New Vegas leads a colony of glowing one ghouls who have maintained religious community and structured social life. The counter-evidence exists too. Plenty of ghouls go feral in timeframes that should not have produced that outcome given how long others have lasted. The factors that push someone toward the feral state remain genuinely unclear in the lore. There are in-universe debates about whether it is a function of cumulative radiation exposure, whether it relates to the psychological health of the individual at the time of transformation, whether isolation accelerates it, whether having a purpose to maintain slows it down. That last possibility is the one that resonates most with the franchise's broader themes. The idea that what keeps a ghoul human is not chemistry but meaning. That the people who lasted the longest, who stayed themselves across decades and centuries of a world that was not built for them and often did not want them, were the ones who found something to care about beyond simple survival. A community to protect, a skill to practice, a grudge to maintain, a child to find. Something that required them to still be a person with a future rather than just a body with a past. Ghouls are discriminated against throughout the wasteland. Their appearance codes as wrong to human brains in ways that are hard to override. And most societies with the luxury of having prejudices use that particular one freely. The NCR formally excluded ghouls from citizenship in some of their codes. Communities that welcomed ghouls existed but were the exception. The casual cruelty directed at ghouls across the franchise is treated as normal in-world in a way that is meant to make the player uncomfortable, especially once you have spent enough time with ghoul characters to understand that what you are watching is straightforward bigotry directed at beings who are just trying to navigate a world that wants them to be monsters. The really interesting question the ghouls raise, and Fallout keeps circling back to it without landing a definitive answer, is whether the extended lifespan changes you in ways that make you something genuinely different from the person you were before, something that might not even be human anymore in a way that matters, rather than just in a biological way. Cooper Howard, before the bombs fell, was a man who believed in America, who believed in the values his country claimed to stand for, even as the evidence mounted that the country's actions did not reflect those values. 200 years of seeing exactly what the systems and institutions he trusted actually produced might reasonably produce someone who no longer believes in anything collective at all. Someone who has decided that the only thing you can trust is what you can see directly in front of you, what you can put your hands on, what is real in the immediate moment. That is not the same as nihilism. It is something more particular. It is the pragmatism of someone who has been lied to by enough grand narratives that they have developed an immunity to them. And in a world where every faction claims to be building the future humanity deserves, that immunity reads as wisdom. The specific way that the Fallout television series handles ghoul psychology is worth spending time with, because it adds dimensions to the lore that the games had largely gestured at without fully developing. Cooper Howard's experience as the ghoul is not just about the physical facts of his condition. It is about what it does to a person's relationship with meaning when everything that gave life meaning in its original form is gone. Cooper Howard before the war was someone whose career was built on embodying a specific American mythology. The cowboy, the frontier hero, the individual who stands for what is right in a landscape that has been rendered morally simple by the necessities of survival. He made westerns. He was the face of an idealized past that, even in the pre-war period, was already being revealed as more complicated than the mythology suggested. His storyline in the show, in its pre-war flashbacks, is specifically about a man becoming aware that the idealized version of America he had built his career celebrating may not correspond to the actual America that exists around him. 200 years of the post-war world is essentially a graduate seminar in that exact subject. Everything Cooper Howard believed about America before the war, the capacity for self-correction, the fundamental decency of its institutional structures, the idea that when you look beneath the propaganda you find something worth believing in rather than just more propaganda, has been tested against 2 centuries of evidence. The evidence is not encouraging. What the ghoul retains, across all of that, is a code. Not the same code he started with. A leaner one, reduced by experience to what he considers essential. He does not lie. He does his job. He does not take things he has not earned. He extends a very limited and conditional form of mercy to people who surprise him with their honesty or their courage. This is not the moral framework of the cowboy hero he used to play. It is the moral framework of someone who has had most moral frameworks tested to destruction and is working with what survived. The fan theory that ghouls who remain coherent over long periods do so through the maintenance of purpose has real support in Cooper Howard's specific case. He has a purpose that predates the war, and that the war intensified rather than erasing. He is looking for his family. That search, maintained across 2 centuries of a world that would have made most purposes feel futile, is the thread that connects the pre-war actor to the post-war bounty hunter. It is not a happy purpose. It does not produce good outcomes for everyone he encounters in its pursuit. But it is real, and it is his, and it has kept him the particular kind of coherent that allows him to still be a self, rather than just a persistent biological process. The glowing ones are the ghoul variant the franchise has explored least thoroughly relative to their narrative potential. In the games, they are primarily encountered as enemy variants with additional radiation emission capabilities. More dangerous than standard ferals, able to heal other ghouls in their vicinity, and radiating enough to damage unprotected humans simply through proximity. But the occasional non-feral glowing one, like Jason Bright in New Vegas, who leads a colony of glowing ghouls and has developed a religious interpretation of their situation, suggests that the additional radiation saturation does not necessarily produce additional cognitive degradation. It might, in some cases, produce something else. Jason Bright's community of glowing ones in New Vegas has maintained social organization, religious practice, and a collectively held purpose across the years of their isolation. They are waiting, in the language of their faith, for a moment of transcendence. The mechanics of what they are actually planning, which involves a rocket, the Repcon facility that houses them, is mundane enough. But the fact that they have maintained coherent community and shared purpose while existing in a state of radiation saturation that should have accelerated fertilization raises genuine questions about what the relationship between radiation, exposure, and cognitive stability actually is. The Wasteland's understanding of ghoul biology is, in-universe, limited. Surface dwellers have access to pre-war medical texts that are fragmentary and often wrong. The Brotherhood of Steel hoards medical technology, but is not particularly interested in applying it to ghoul welfare. The Institute's research has touched on ghoul biology only tangentially. What actually happens at the cellular and neurological level during ghoulification, and what the factors are that determine whether a given ghoul maintains coherence or loses it, remains genuinely unknown within the fiction. The people most qualified to study it are the ghouls themselves, and they have generally had more pressing concerns than contributing to the scientific literature on their own condition. Part 6. Mr. House, the last pre-war man, and his particular kind of vision. He was 58 years old when the bombs fell, and his plan had been in place for years before that. Robert Edwin House, founder and CEO of Robco Industries, was by any reasonable measure one of the most intelligent human beings who had ever lived in the Fallout universe. He was aware of this about himself in a way that was neither modest nor entirely arrogant, just accurate. He had used the resources available to him through his company and his personal fortune to build a predictive model of geopolitical collapse, and that model had told him, with a precision he found both professionally satisfying and personally terrifying, that the Great War was coming. He could not stop it. Nobody could stop it at the scale it was happening, but he could, perhaps, limit certain catastrophic outcomes. He could save Las Vegas. The Lucky 38 Casino, the tall stratosphere-like tower that dominates the New Vegas skyline, was not just House's home. It was his command center, his life support system, and, as the years accumulated after the war, essentially his entire world. He outfitted it with missile defense systems, radar jammers, and a laser grid capable of intercepting incoming warheads. He connected himself to the building's systems through a direct interface that, over time, became the primary way he interacted with reality. His physical body, kept alive through an array of life-extending technology in a cryogenic adjacent chamber deep within the tower, continued deteriorating in the way bodies do when they are sustained by machines rather than actually living. But his mind remained functional, connected to the city's systems, monitoring and adjusting and waiting. House's plan, stripped to its essential structure, was this: intercept the worst of the nuclear bombardment aimed at Las Vegas and the surrounding area, maintain the city's infrastructure through his Securitron robot army, wait out the immediate chaos of the post-war period, and then emerge as the controlling power over the region's most valuable resource, which was Hoover Dam and the electrical capacity it represented. He needed the Platinum chip, a data storage device that would allow him to massively upgrade his Securitron army to complete the second phase of the plan. He miscalculated the timing of the Great War by about 22 hours, which meant the chip was in transit when the bombs fell and spent the next 200 years lost in the wasteland, eventually becoming the MacGuffin that drives the entire plot of Fallout, New Vegas. He waited, he managed, he maintained, and after 200 years of this, he was still there, still functional, still in control of the strip, still planning. House is a character who forces you to do something uncomfortable. Take him seriously. His vision for the future of humanity is coherent. His reasoning is defensible in ways that the reasoning of most Fallout factions is not. He argues, with evidence, that representative democracy had its chance and produced nuclear war, that the NCR was building a new version of the system that had already failed once, that Caesar's Legion was building something older and more honest about its brutality, but with no better ultimate outcome. His alternative was an enlightened technocracy, which in practice meant him making decisions about the direction of human civilization in collaboration with a very small number of highly capable people he selected for that purpose. The obvious problem with this, and the game presents it as a genuine problem rather than a deal-breaker, is that you are being asked to trust that the one person with unchecked power will use it well. House has good reasons to believe he is that person. He has demonstrated competence at a scale that is genuinely impressive. He saved an entire city from nuclear annihilation through careful advance planning. He kept a functioning economy operating in a region that had been a wasteland for 2 centuries. He read the political situation well enough to play the NCR and Caesar's Legion against each other for years, without committing to either. But every argument for his trustworthiness is also an argument about him, made by him. The Securitrons that enforce his will answer to him. The terms of engagement for the factions he controls are set by him. The long-term plan for human civilization he has developed was developed entirely by him, without democratic input, without the ability of the people affected by it to shape or challenge it. The checks on his power are himself. That is the entire list. House's character, according to Chris Avallone, who wrote him, was inspired initially by Howard Hughes, the American aviator and industrialist who transformed Las Vegas in the mid-20th century and then spent his last years as a reclusive, increasingly troubled billionaire who controlled an enormous amount of resources without any oversight whatsoever. The comparison to more contemporary figures, the Silicon Valley technologists who are convinced that their individual brilliance qualifies them to make decisions about the future of the species, has become increasingly difficult to avoid as the years have passed. Avallone himself said in interviews that his sense of the character has changed as he watched real-world versions of the archetype emerge. What makes House enduringly interesting is that the game does not simply make him a villain. His vision of humanity reaching the stars, of civilization continuing beyond the radioactive mud century that followed the Great War, is presented as genuine and perhaps achievable. His specific methods for achieving it are cruel in particular ways, exploitative of the 3 families who run the casinos on the Strip, dismissive of the Securitrons as individuals, but the underlying goal is not evil. It is just the goal of someone who has decided that the ends justify the means and that he personally is the only qualified judge of what the ends are. The Platinum Chip storyline, the specific way that New Vegas begins, is almost a thought experiment about this. The courier, shot in the head over the chip, survives through a combination of luck and the particular way Doc Mitchell practices medicine, and then spends the rest of the game deciding what to do about the enormous amount of power the chip represents. Give it to House, and you give one-man control over the most powerful military force in the Mojave. Give it to Caesar's Legion, and you hand a brilliant but fundamentally backward vision of Rome rebuilt in fire to the single most capable person in that vision. Give it to the NCR, and you accelerate the spread of a flawed but recognizably decent democratic institution. Use it to run New Vegas independently through the AI called Yes Man, and you do not solve the problem of unchecked power, you just relocate it. None of these answers is clean. Fallout, New Vegas is specifically designed to not have a clean answer, but House comes closest to forcing you to confront the question the game is really asking, which is whether individual brilliance justifies individual control. Whether the fact that someone is right more often than other people means they should be trusted without limit. Whether the person who is the most competent person in the room is automatically the one who should be making decisions for everyone in the building. House's final conversation, when the player comes to confront him, has a quality of genuine tragedy that is rare in games. He is someone who spent over 200 years keeping himself alive specifically to execute his vision, who is finally close enough to that vision to see its shape clearly, and who is now in a conversation with someone who might take it all away. He makes his arguments well. He is not wrong about everything. He is not even wrong about most things. He is wrong about the part that matters most. The part that is not about strategy or planning, but about whether any individual human being, no matter how extraordinary, has the right to be the answer to the question of what humanity should become. The Lucky 38's lights were still on when the Fallout television series arrived in 2024. Whether that meant House was still in there, still running, still planning, was one of the questions that animated the most intense fan debates in the history of the franchise. The specific detail of the Platinum Chip and what it represented to House's 200-year plan is worth examining more carefully. The chip was the key to the final phase of House's Securitron upgrade. Without it, he was managing the Strip with robots whose combat capabilities were adequate for maintaining order, but not for the kind of decisive military action that would be required to push the NCR back across the Colorado and deal with the Legion. Definitively. With it, every Securitron in his network would become substantially more formidable, and his ability to enforce his preferred outcomes across the Mojave would increase proportionally. He had been waiting for it for 200 years. Not passively, not simply sitting in his life support chamber hoping someone would eventually bring the thing to him. He had been managing, planning, positioning. The deal he struck with the three families to run the Strip's casinos was part of it. He needed an economy capable of sustaining the Strip's infrastructure and generating the revenue that would eventually fund the next stage. The diplomatic balance he maintained between the NCR and the Legion, keeping them focused on each other rather than on him, was part of it. Every decision he made for 2 centuries was in service of the moment when the chip arrived and the final phase could begin. And then a courier shot in the head and left in a desert came to Goodsprings and woke up and started asking questions. House's relationship with the courier is one of the most carefully constructed power dynamics in the franchise. He needs them, specifically and urgently, in a way he has not needed anyone in a very long time. The Securitrons who work for him are capable, but they cannot navigate the social and political landscape of the Mojave with the flexibility a human agent has. The three families are useful, but they are motivated by their own interests, which align with House's only imperfectly. The courier is, as far as House is concerned, an asset with a specific combination of capabilities. They are already in the Mojave, they are already motivated, they have already demonstrated the kind of capability that survives being shot in the head and finding their way to New Vegas anyway. He frames their relationship as a partnership, which is technically accurate in the way that the relationship between a chess player and a particularly effective piece is technically a partnership. The courier does the things that require a mobile, socially capable agent operating in the complex human environment of the Mojave. House does the things that require 200 years of accumulated knowledge of the region's political landscape and the resources to reward or punish actors across that landscape. Neither can achieve the goal without the other. The asymmetry is that House has thought about this arrangement for a great deal longer than the courier has and is operating with correspondingly more information about where it is going. Whether that asymmetry constitutes exploitation is one of the questions the game invites you to sit with. House is not hiding what he wants. He tells the courier, with remarkable directness for someone whose survival depends on maintaining significant advantages over the people he works with, exactly what his plan is and what role he has in mind for them within it. The information he provides is accurate. The resources he offers are real. The future he describes, if his plan succeeds, is genuinely possible, and arguably genuinely better than most of the alternatives. The courier is free to walk away at any point. But walking away from Mr. House in the Mojave of 2281 is not exactly a free choice in the purest sense, because House is already one of the most powerful forces in the region, and declining to serve his interests puts you on the side of everyone he is working against, which has significant practical consequences. The freedom to refuse is real. The costs of refusing are substantial. This is not, in the end, so different from the kind of choice that most people make about the institutions that structure their lives. Technically voluntary, practically constrained by what the alternatives look like. House's physical condition, as revealed when the player finds their way to his chamber in the Lucky 38, is one of the franchise's most viscerally affecting images. A man who was, by contemporary photographs, athletic and confident, and evidently healthy, reduced to something barely recognizable, sustained by technology that is keeping a body going long past the point where the body would otherwise have given up. He is aware of how he looks. He has been aware of it for a long time. He made the choice, sometime in the years after the war, that what he wanted to accomplish mattered more than the physical dignity of the body he was accomplishing it in. Whether that choice was correct depends, as almost everything in this franchise does, on how you feel about what he was trying to accomplish. The question of what happens to Mr. House's plan if he succeeds is one the game deliberately leaves unanswered. He sketches a vision, in broad strokes, of New Vegas as the foundation for a civilization that eventually reaches the stars. He has specifics about the next decade, the one after that. But 200 years beyond that, his plan runs into the same problem every plan of that duration runs into. The future changes in ways that even the most sophisticated modeling cannot predict. The people who will be living in the world he is building will have their own ideas about what to do with it. The institutions he creates will evolve in directions he cannot control. The legacy of Roger Maxson at the Brotherhood, of the Enclave's founding vision at the Enclave, of Vault-Tech's original intentions at every vault, is that organizations built around individual visions tend to preserve the forms of those visions while losing the substance. House knows this. He has watched it happen for 2 centuries. Whether he has a solution to it, beyond simply living long enough to course correct when the drift becomes apparent, is something the game leaves open. It might be the most interesting question about his plan that never gets asked in the dialogue. Part 7. The Courier, and what makes someone the most dangerous person in the world. Courier 6 is never given a name in the game itself. That is intentional. You name them. You choose their background, their skills, their face, but across all the optional materials, the holotapes and letters, and the enormous supplementary world that Fallout New Vegas builds around its central mystery, a portrait emerges of someone who, before the game begins, was already one of the most remarkable people in the Mojave Wasteland. The basic facts are these. The Courier was a professional. They had been running deliveries across the wasteland for years, a dangerous and demanding career in a region where the roads are populated by raiders, scorpions, and the occasional well-organized military force moving through territory it considers its own. At some point before the game begins, the Courier had done something significant enough in the Divide, a region of California shattered by some kind of catastrophic seismic or explosive event, that Ulysses, the DLC antagonist of Lonesome Road, identified them personally and chose to refuse the chip delivery specifically because the Courier was the one assigned to it. That detail is worth sitting with. Ulysses, who is himself a remarkable person, a former member of almost every major faction in the game, deeply read in the history of the wasteland, intensely deliberate about his decisions, specifically refused a job because the Courier was going to be given the next delivery after him. That implies history. That implies the Courier had done something, or represented something, that Ulysses felt required a response. The Divide DLC reveals what that history was, or at least one version of it. The Courier had passed through the Divide while carrying packages, and those packages had carried signals that triggered buried warheads, and the result was a cataclysm that destroyed what had been a community capable of becoming something significant. Ulysses believed this was done knowingly. The game presents evidence that it was not, but the Courier's passage through the Divide, innocent or not in terms of intent, had consequences that were irreversible and enormous. Then there is the question of who the Courier actually was before the game. The game never answers this directly, which is both a design choice and a deliberate thematic one. Several characters react to the Courier in ways that suggest they have a history that goes beyond what a random professional would have. Doc Mitchell gives them a Pip-Boy without explanation, and there is a theory in the community that the Pip-Boy was the Courier's own, kept by Mitchell from a previous encounter. The Lonesome Drifter, a wandering musician, can be his implied biological son through dialogue that the game drops almost casually. One of the most persistent fan theories is that the Courier is a descendant of one of the earlier Fallout protagonists, potentially the Chosen One from Fallout 2. The mathematics work out. The Chosen One could plausibly have had children whose children could plausibly have had children who would be the right age to be the Courier in New Vegas. The Vault 13 canteen available through the Courier's Stash pre-order pack, an item specifically tied to the original Vault Dweller's story, has been used as circumstantial evidence. The Lonesome Drifter's implied parentage fits the timeline. Nothing in the game confirms this theory, but nothing in the game contradicts it either, and Obsidian Entertainment, which developed New Vegas, was deeply committed to honoring the continuity of the original Black Isle games. What makes the Courier interesting as a character study is the specific way the game handles their agency. They were shot in the head, they flatlined. A robot ran their body to a small-town doctor named Mitchell, and Mitchell put them back together, and when they woke up they had the choice of whether to pursue the people who did this to them or to walk away entirely. The game does not assume they want revenge. It acknowledges that what was done to them was a genuine violation but leaves the response completely open. And then, across the length of the game, the choices they make determine the fate of an entire region. Not in the vague, optional sense of some open-world games, but concretely and specifically. The Courier's decision at the end of Fallout, New Vegas reshapes the political map of the American Southwest. The faction they back either takes Hoover Dam and, with it, decisive control of the region's power and water, or they end the conflict in a way that leaves the Strip independent. The ripple effects of that decision extend across what we can know of the Fallout timeline for decades after the game ends. The theory the community has held most persistently about the Courier's specific status in the world is that they are not just competent, but genuinely post-human in some sense. Someone who was shot through the head and survived, who walked back from death through sheer biological stubbornness, who then managed to navigate the most politically complex conflict the post-war Southwest had seen, playing factions against each other with a patience and skill that should require decades of strategic education. The game lets you play the courier as a barely literate drifter who solves everything with a minigun, but the bones of the story describe someone who might be the most capable individual the post-war period has yet produced. There is a simpler version of this theory. The courier's survival was not just luck. Whatever quality makes some people walk away from things that should have killed them, whatever combination of biology and psychology and sheer will, the courier has more of it than is statistically normal. The head wound that introduced us to them would have killed almost anyone. It did not kill them. That is either remarkable luck, or it is evidence that the courier is operating at the far edge of what human beings can survive. Given that the game then places them in the center of a civilization-defining conflict and lets them resolve it, possibly both, the moment the courier wakes up in Doc Mitchell's house is one of gaming's best opening sequences precisely because of how much it does not explain. You make choices about who you are, a name, a background, a set of skills. But the game's mechanics of self-definition operate on top of a specific situation that was already in motion before the game began. Someone tried to kill this person, specifically and deliberately. That implies knowledge, which implies history, which implies that the blank slate the game presents for player customization is not actually blank. It has been written on already. The game is just not showing you what was written. The character of Benny, the man who ordered the hit, is interesting for what his choice reveals about the courier's reputation. Benny is not an amateur. He is the chairman of one of the 3 families that run the strip, someone with resources and connections and enough operational capability to intercept a delivery in the middle of the Mojave and stage it to look like a robbery. He knows who was hired to carry the chip. He decided that killing them was a better option than simply attempting to steal the chip without identifying the courier. That decision suggests he believed that leaving the courier alive was more dangerous than leaving a witness who could identify him, which is an interesting thing to believe about someone you are about to shoot in the head and bury. The dialogue options available to the courier when they finally confront Benny include choices that suggest possible prior connections between them. The game does not canonize any of these, but the fact that Obsidian built them in, that they thought enough about the courier's pre-game history to create narrative space for it without filling it in, suggests that the decision to leave the backstory open was deliberate rather than incidental. They were making room for a history they had thought about. The courier's relationship with Ulysses, developed in the Lonesome Road DLC, is the closest the game comes to defining who the courier was before the story began. And what it reveals is not a clear history, but a contested one. Ulysses believes the courier destroyed the Divide, a community that was developing towards something significant through the delivery work they were doing. The courier may or may not have known what the packages contained. The evidence suggests they did not, but the outcome was the same. A community is gone, and Ulysses spent years looking for the specific person he holds responsible. Lonesome Road is, structurally, a conversation. Ulysses calls the courier across the wasteland, and they walk toward each other for the entirety of the DLC, listening to transmissions and reading holotapes and building a picture of a conflict that has its roots in something the courier does not fully remember. When they finally meet, Ulysses is not simply a villain seeking revenge. He is someone who has been shaped by a specific loss into a specific kind of philosophy, and who wants the courier, specifically the courier, to understand what was lost and what they are responsible for. The possibility that the courier does not remember what happened in the Divide, that whatever they carried through that region predates their current memory or was simply too minor for them to have tracked carefully at the time, does not resolve Ulysses' anger. It just makes the situation more tragic. One person shaped by a loss, and one person who may not even remember the event that caused it, standing at the end of a ruined road having a conversation about accountability and memory and what you owe the past. The courier can kill Ulysses. They can also convince him that his path leads nowhere productive, that whatever the Divide represented, it cannot be rebuilt through the act of revenge he is planning. The best outcome, the one that requires the most investment in the conversation and the most genuine engagement with what Ulysses is saying, is one in which the conflict is resolved through understanding rather than violence. Not forgiveness exactly. Something more complicated. An acknowledgement that what happened happened, and that what happens next does not have to be determined by it. That is the courier in their fullest expression. someone capable of taking responsibility for things that predate their current self-knowledge and finding a path through them that does not simply replicate the original harm. That capacity for genuine reckoning with difficult history is what makes them genuinely dangerous, not just in the tactical sense, but in the sense that matters. They are capable of changing things that have been held in place by the weight of the past for too long. Part 8: Synths and the Question That Keeps Not Having an Answer. The Institute, in Fallout 4, is a faction built underground beneath the ruins of what was once the Commonwealth Institute of Technology in Boston. For decades, it has been the most feared and least understood presence in the Commonwealth wasteland. People on the surface know the Institute primarily through their products, the synthetic humanoids, called synths, that the Institute has been developing and deploying into the surface world for purposes that are, from the surface perspective, opaque and often terrifying. The first-generation synths are the easiest to understand. They are robots. Sophisticated robots with humanoid forms, capable of performing complex tasks, but robots. Nobody disputes their status. Second-generation synths are more unsettling, still mechanical in their visible structure, but built with learning capabilities and behavioral flexibility that edge towards something that is not quite human, but is not straightforwardly mechanical either. The third-generation synths are the ones the entire narrative of Fallout 4 is built around. They are indistinguishable from human beings. Their biology is synthetic at the molecular level, but it produces the same outputs: blood, breath, thought, memory, experience. They eat, they dream, they develop emotional attachments. They grow and change through experience in ways that the programming of their creation did not fully specify. The Institute's position is that synths are products, sophisticated tools, property. The fact that a third-generation synth is indistinguishable from a human being by any external measure does not, in the Institute's framework, make it a human being. What makes a person is something the Institute is not prepared to specify. But whatever it is, synths do not have it. This position is convenient for an institution that creates synths and uses them for labor and infiltration without their consent, which is something that requires not thinking too hard about what consent would mean to an entity capable of having preferences about its own life. The Railroad, the faction dedicated to synth liberation, takes the opposite position. If a being can think, feel, form relationships, suffer, prefer one outcome over another for reasons that reflect genuine values rather than just programmed responses, then that being is a person. The question of its origin is irrelevant to the question of its rights. A synth built in a lab is not more or less a person than a human being assembled through biological processes that the human also did not choose. Nick Valentine sits at the center of this debate in a way that makes it impossible to resolve cleanly. He is a second-generation synth who was built with the memories and personality imprint of a pre-war human detective, also named Nick Valentine, who died long before the Great War ended. The synth who calls himself Nick Valentine has those memories, experiences them as his own, has built a life in Diamond City based on the character and values that those memories shaped. He knows he is a synth. He is deeply ambivalent about what that means, which is exactly the kind of ambivalence a person would have in his situation. The question the game poses through Nick is whether the memories are enough. If you have a complete, continuous, subjective experience of having been someone, does it matter that the biological substrate originally associated with that experience has been gone for centuries? The personality was real. The values are real. The experience of the present moment is real. The synth's suffering when he contemplates his nature is real. Is the person real? The Institute's answer, in the abstract, would be no. But the Institute never looks directly at Nick Valentine when giving that answer, because Nick Valentine is complicated in ways that make the answer feel dishonest. Then there is the theory, held by a significant portion of the Fallout 4 fandom, that the sole survivor, the player character, is themselves a synth. The argument goes like this. The sole survivor was, supposedly, a real person who was cryogenically frozen in Vault 111 in 2077, along with their spouse and infant son. They were supposed to remain frozen until the surface was safe. Instead, they were woken up once to witness their spouse being murdered and their son being taken, then refrozen and left for another 60 years. They finally wake up in 2287 and emerge into the Commonwealth. But what if the real sole survivor died during those 60 years, and what the Institute did was create a synth built with the original person's memories and release them into the world? The motivation could be experimental, a synth with a genuine emotional drive, the search for a child, rather than an assigned mission to see what a freely motivated synth does when turned loose in a complex social environment. It would explain some things about the narrative, about the emotional precision of the soul survivor's grief, about the way the story keeps looping back to questions of memory and identity and what makes someone themselves. The game does not confirm this. Todd Howard has said the soul survivor is not a synth. But the game also never definitively closes the door on the theory in a way that feels narratively airtight, and the question keeps recurring, especially in conversations with Dima in the Far Harbor DLC, who directly asks you how you would know. How would you know? That is the question Fallout 4 is asking under everything else. How do you know you are who you think you are? How do you know the memories that feel most deeply yours actually belong to you? How do you know the continuity you experience is real? And if the answer is that you cannot know for certain, but the experience of being yourself feels continuous and complete and genuine, what follows from that? What obligations does that create for the people around you, and for you toward yourself? The synth question in Fallout 4 does not have a correct answer. It has a philosophical position embedded in each faction, and the player is left to choose which position they find most defensible, knowing that the choice will shape what the Commonwealth looks like in the future. Whether it is full of beings that can be used without ethical constraint, or full of beings that have to be treated as persons even when the institutions that created them insist otherwise. The Fallout universe consistently places this question in front of its player without resolving it, because resolving it would mean taking a firm position on one of the oldest and most contested questions in philosophy. And Fallout, at its best, knows that the questions matter more than the answers. The DLC Far Harbor, set on a fog-shrouded island off the coast of Maine, is Fallout 4's deepest exploration of the synth consciousness question. Dima, the synth who leads the island's synth refuge called Acadia, is a prototype from the same series that produced Nick Valentine. He has been operating independently for decades, building a community, making consequential decisions, forming his own ethical framework through experience rather than programming. He is, by any reasonable assessment, a person. Dima also made a decision that is genuinely morally terrible, and the game does not let you pretend otherwise. He killed a man. Not in combat, not in defense of himself or his community, but deliberately and with premeditation, in order to take the man's place and maintain a cover that would protect Acadia. He knows this was wrong. He has been living with the knowledge for years. He has a specific and coherent explanation for why he made the decision he made, and the explanation does not erase the fact. What Far Harbor does with this is remarkable. It presents a being who is clearly a person, clearly capable of moral reasoning, clearly experiencing something like conscience in relation to a genuinely bad decision, and it asks the player to decide what accountability looks like for that being. The humans of Far Harbor who want Dima to face consequences have a legitimate grievance. The synths of Acadia who depend on Dima's leadership have a legitimate concern about what those consequences would mean for their community. Dima himself has made no attempt to escape accountability beyond the decision not to volunteer the information. The resolution the game offers, or does not offer, is deliberately unsatisfying in ways that feel honest to the question, rather than evasive. There is no clean answer about what justice looks like when the person who committed a harm is also the foundation of a community that would suffer greatly from their removal. There is no clean answer about what accountability means for a type of being whose moral status the dominant institutions of the surrounding world do not recognize. What the game is doing through Dima is extending the synth consciousness question into territory that is genuinely uncomfortable for everyone, including people who already believe synths are persons. Because if synths are persons, then they are persons who can be morally responsible for their actions, which means they can be morally culpable, which means the same capacity for genuine experience that makes their suffering matter also makes their wrongdoing matter. Dima being a person means Dima being accountable for what a person did. The easiest position to hold about synths from outside the situation is that they deserve protection and liberation. Far Harbor makes that position harder by presenting a synth who needed protection and liberation, and who also did something that the protection and liberation framework does not resolve. It is a genuinely sophisticated piece of moral storytelling in a franchise that is consistently better at moral storytelling than it gets credit for. The Railroad as an institution is worth examining in this context. They are, structurally, an underground railroad, drawing explicit comparison to the historical abolitionist network that assisted enslaved people in escaping to freedom. The comparison is meaningful, and the game intends it seriously. But the railroad also has limitations that the historical comparison highlights rather than obscures. The historical Underground Railroad was working to help people whose humanity was not in genuine doubt, even among many of the people who enslaved them. The railroad in Fallout 4 is working on behalf of beings whose humanity is in genuine dispute within the fiction, which means they face a different kind of challenge. They need to change not just the practice but the framework for understanding what counts as a person. The railroad's tactics are largely operational rather than political. They rescue synths, they give them new memories and new identities, and release them into the Commonwealth population. They do not, for the most part, engage in the broader philosophical and political work of arguing for synth personhood in ways that might change the institutional landscape. This is understandable given that they are a secret organization whose discovery would mean destruction. But it means that each synth they rescue is made safe only by being made invisible, by having their synthetic nature hidden rather than accepted. The liberation they offer is real and it is genuinely valuable, and it is also a liberation that requires the liberated to pretend to be something they are not. That particular cost of the railroad's model of liberation is something the game makes visible without making loud. The synths who are successfully placed in the Commonwealth population have their freedom, but they have it contingent on a secret. Their safety depends on nobody knowing what they are. That is a specific kind of freedom with a specific kind of limit, and the game trusts the player to notice it. The specific evidence for the sole survivor synth theory is worth laying out in detail, because it is more substantial than casual dismissal suggests. The sole survivor is presented as having been cryogenically frozen in 2077 and thawing in 2287. But the specific circumstances of their awakening are strange. They are woken up once, to witness their spouse's murder and their son's abduction, and then refrozen. The people who did this, agents of the Institute, needed the sole survivor to witness those events for reasons the game eventually makes clear. Sean, their son, is the current director of the Institute, an elderly man who spent his life in the Institute and who is now running a test. He wanted to see what his biological parent would do when released into the Commonwealth. He wanted to see what motivated them. But Sean is himself a synth theorist's nightmare, because everything about him suggests that what he wanted was not the original sole survivor but a synth built from the original's template. He had 60 years to take genetic material and build one. He had the technology. He had the motivation, which was to run exactly the kind of open environment motivation study that a synth with a compelling personal drive would enable. The player character's urgency in finding Sean, the specific emotional texture of their search, is exactly what a well-motivated synth would produce, and exactly what an actually thawed human would also produce. The game cannot distinguish between these two scenarios from inside them. Dima's question, the one he asks in Far Harbor, is not rhetorical. He is asking it to someone who may be exactly the kind of being he is asking about, and the player cannot answer it with certainty, because the memories feel real, and the grief feels real, and the determination feels real. But Dima knows better than most that these things can feel real, because they were built from something that was real, not because the current experiencer of them is the same person who originally had them. Todd Howard's confirmation that the sole survivor is not a synth is a developer statement rather than a narrative statement, and the Fallout franchise has a tradition of developer statements not fully constraining what the narrative makes available to interpretation. The game is designed to make you uncertain. The uncertainty is not a bug in the experience. It is what the experience is trying to produce, because that uncertainty is the same uncertainty that runs through the entire synth question and that the franchise thinks is genuinely important for people to sit with rather than resolve prematurely. The thing that the sole survivor synth theory does to the experience of playing Fallout 4, if you hold it as a possibility, is change the texture of the main quest. Finding Sean becomes not just a parental imperative but an existential investigation. The answer to who Sean is and what he has built and what he wants from you might also be an answer to what you are. The Institute becomes not just a sinister organization to be dismantled or joined, but the place where you were made, or at least where your maker decided what you would be. The choice between factions becomes a choice about identity. Do you side with the people who claim you are a real person, or with the people who built you, or with the people who think of you as a product, or with the people who just want to watch what you do next? None of that changes depending on whether the synth theory is canon. All of it is available in the game as written, for anyone who chooses to hold the uncertainty rather than resolve it by fiat. Part 9. Harold, Bob, and the most quietly devastating story in the franchise. There is a man with a tree growing out of his head. That sentence sounds like the setup to a joke, but Harold is not a joke. Harold is, over the course of the franchise's history, one of the most complete portraits of what it means to survive for long enough that survival becomes its own kind of weight. Harold was born 5 years before the Great War, in 2072. He survived the bombs falling in a vault, emerged into the wasteland, and built a life as a caravan merchant in the formative years of the Hub, the trading settlement that would become one of the most important communities in post-war California. He was good at it. He had a talent for getting along with people, for finding the right thing to say, for being useful without being threatening. In a world where most survival strategies required you to either be very dangerous or very useful, Harold chose the latter and it served him well. Then he met the man who would become the master. This was before Richard Gray had transformed, before the FEV, before the months in the vats, before the consciousness expansion and the ideology and the army. Gray was still recognizably human when Harold encountered him, part of an expedition that ended up at the Mariposa military base. The details of what happened in that encounter are hazy, as Harold's memory of it was always somewhat unreliable, but the outcome was clear. Harold was exposed to the forced evolutionary virus. Unlike Gray, whose relatively clean, pre-war biology allowed the FEV to interact with his DNA in a way that expanded his capabilities, Harold had spent enough time in the post-war environment to have some level of ambient FEV exposure. The result was a mutation that was unique, strange, and not at all what either the pre-war scientists or the Master had produced in their controlled experiments. Harold did not become a super mutant. He did not expand into something vast and terrible. He became, in his own words, something between a ghoul and a super mutant, in a category that had no name because nothing else had ever occupied it. And something started growing on his head. The thing growing on Harold's head was initially small. A sprout. A tiny green sprig of something that, in the ruins of the world, looked entirely out of place. Harold named it Bob, or Herbert. He was never entirely consistent on this point. The plant became his companion in the way that a person who is profoundly isolated will sometimes anthropomorphize whatever is nearby and available for conversation. Over the decades, Bob grew. By the time of Fallout 1, Harold was an established figure in the Hub's community of unusual beings, a man with a tree on his head who knew things, and was willing to share them with travelers who treated him decently. By Fallout 2, he had moved east, continuing his wandering, still talking to Bob and being occasionally embarrassed about it. By Fallout 3, something had changed. Bob had taken over. In Fallout 3, Harold is not wandering anymore. He cannot wander. The tree that had been growing on his head for decades had finally done something that a tree, given enough time and a hospitable host, will eventually do. It had put down roots. The roots had spread through Harold's body and eventually through the cave system beneath the northern capital wasteland. And the tree, now vast and named Herbert by the community that had formed around it, had spread seeds across the area. Those seeds had grown into a small forest in one of the most otherwise desolate corners of the wasteland. The people who found Harold built a community around him. They called themselves the Tree Minders, and they worshipped Harold as a deity, the source of life and growth in a dead world, the living proof that something green and patient could survive even this. Harold himself was not thrilled about the deification. He was not under any illusions about being a god. He was a man who had a very long life and a very strange condition, and who was now literally rooted to the ground and unable to do anything about it. What Harold wanted, when you finally talked to him in Fallout 3, was one of two things. Either help his tree spread further so that the seeds would eventually cover the entire wasteland in green and give the world a chance to heal, or help him die. That is it. Those are his two wishes. Not power, not revenge against the things that had happened to him. The ability to give one last gift to the world, or the mercy of an ending he had not been able to find on his own. The player can choose either outcome for Harold, and the game presents both as valid, which is one of the most quietly courageous narrative choices Fallout 3 makes. Harold's desire to die is not treated as pathological or as something to be talked him out of. He is 200 years old. He has been through things that would have broken most people before the century mark. He has watched everyone he knew die, watched the world he remembered become increasingly mythological, watched his own body become something he did not choose and cannot control. If he wants it to end, the game trusts him to know his own mind about that. The tree that grew from Harold's head is simultaneously a symbol of hope and a portrait of something deeply poignant. Because Harold himself, the person, did not choose to become the source of new life in a dead world. It happened to him. The same mutation that changed everything else about his existence also turned him into something the world needed, without asking him whether he wanted to be needed in that particular way. There is a theory in the fan community that Harold's tree, Herbert, is actually a new species, something that has emerged from the combination of FEV mutated biology and post-war environmental conditions into something the pre-war world never contained. A tree that can grow in irradiated soil, a tree whose seeds are adapted to the wasteland in ways that make them capable of spreading where nothing else would survive. If that theory is right, Harold's transformation, which looked like a personal catastrophe from inside, was actually the accidental creation of something that could help the world heal. Harold did not know that when it was happening to him. He just knew that something was growing out of his head and that it had a name, and that the name was Bob, or maybe Herbert, and that it was company of a kind. The wasteland is full of tragedies that are also, from the right angle, something else. Harold is maybe the purest example of that double quality. A sad story and a hopeful one at the same time, in proportions that shift depending on where you are standing when you look at it. The question of what Harold's situation means for the ethical framework of the wasteland is one the game plants but does not fully develop. The Treeminders have built a religion around Harold. Their faith centers on the idea that Harold is divine, that the green growth spreading from him is a sacred gift, that his wishes are commandments. But Harold is right there. He can contradict them. He can tell them he is not a god. They mostly hear this as humility, as a divine being refusing the title because the title is insufficient to capture what he is. This is the particular trap of deification. The person being deified loses control of their own narrative. Harold cannot effectively correct the Treeminders' beliefs about him, because any attempt to do so is incorporated into the belief system as further evidence of the quality they are celebrating. His protestations become testimony. His desire for death is reinterpreted as a test or a spiritual metaphor. The community has built a structure of meaning around him that he cannot dismantle from within, and he cannot leave because the tree has taken root. What the player does for Harold, whatever choice they make about his future, is restore some element of agency to someone who has had it progressively stripped away across 2 centuries. The ability to choose the direction of the tree, to determine the scope of what Harold's body will become in the world, is a kind of autonomy even in the midst of constraint. And if the player chooses to help Harold die, the act of carrying out that wish, of taking seriously what Harold has said he wants, is itself a form of respect that the Treeminders, for all their devotion, have been unable to extend to him. Harold represents something specific about the wasteland's relationship with the unusual and the unprecedented. When something new enters the world, something that does not fit existing categories, the community around it tends to make it fit anyway by forcing it into the nearest available category. Harold is the most unprecedented thing in the Fallout universe, a being who is not human, not a ghoul, not a super mutant, not a synth, not a robot, something singular and unclassified. The Treeminders respond by making him a god, which is the extreme version of a very human tendency to deal with things that do not fit by assigning them the most extreme version of a familiar role rather than holding the genuinely new thing in genuine uncertainty. The tree, Bob or Herbert, depending on Harold's mood, is also doing something unusual in the Fallout ecology. It is growing in soil that should not support it. It is spreading seeds that are taking root where other plants have failed. The specific biology of whatever species it represents, whatever the FEV has made of the plant matter that found Harold's mutated skull a hospitable substrate, has apparently produced something adapted to the post-war environment in ways that pre-war plant life was not. If the theory that Harold's tree is a genuinely new species has merit, then his tragedy is also the origin story of one of the most significant ecological events in the post-war world. That is the kind of thing the Fallout universe does quietly, places enormous significance in understated places. The most important ecological development in the capital wasteland is happening in a cave tended by a small community of believers, centered on a very tired man who just wants to be left alone or else help to finally rest. The specific way that the Fallout franchise handles religion and faith is worth examining as its own thread through the lore, because it represents one of the more subtle aspects of the world building. The Wasteland has produced multiple religious movements, and every single one of them is built on something real. Real events, real beings, real phenomena that the believers are trying to organize into a framework of meaning. The children of the cathedral in Fallout 1 are worshipping the Master, who is genuinely a remarkable and powerful being. The Treeminders in Fallout 3 are worshipping Harold, who genuinely provides something like divine sustenance through the tree. The Atom worshippers in Fallout 4 revere the nuclear fire, which genuinely transformed the world in ways that are both destructive and generative. What the franchise is saying about religion through these communities is not that faith is stupid or delusional. It is that human beings will build frameworks of meaning from whatever materials are available to them, and that in a world full of genuinely extraordinary phenomena, the materials available produce genuinely interesting theological constructions. The children of the cathedral have bad theology not because their deity is fake, but because their deity turns out to be built on a false premise. The Treeminders have somewhat better theology because Harold, whatever his personal preferences about his status, genuinely sustains them. The Atom worshippers have what might be the most defensible theology in the franchise. The Atom genuinely split the world into a before and an after, genuinely remade the conditions of existence, genuinely requires a different relationship with life and death and time than the pre-war world required. The followers of the Apocalypse, who appear in multiple games but most fully in New Vegas, represent the secular equivalent of religious commitment, a movement of scholars and healers who believe that knowledge and care are the appropriate responses to the wasteland's conditions. They have no theology. They have a practice: gather information, provide medical care, stay out of factional conflicts, give freely without demanding loyalty. They are the most explicitly humanist institution in the franchise, and they are consistently underpowered relative to the militarized factions around them, which is the franchise's quiet comment on what happens to humanist institutions in contexts of sustained violence. The ghost people of the Sierra Madre, encountered in the Dead Money DLC for New Vegas, are one of the franchise's most disturbing religious-adjacent phenomena. They are the former residents of the Sierra Madre Resort, people who were present when the resort's cloud-producing ventilation system was activated, who were changed by the cloud in ways that neither killed them nor left them clearly alive, who have developed behaviors that look like ritual in their repetition and organization, but that appear to operate without any apparent conscious intention behind them. They haunt the Sierra Madre like the memory of a civilization that wanted to be preserved and ended up being frozen instead. The Dead Money DLC is the franchise's sharpest meditation on the specific ways that the desire to hold on to the past can trap you in it. The Sierra Madre was a resort built for the wealthy, a place where the pre-war elite could pretend the rest of the world was not falling apart around them. Its founders spent enormous resources trying to preserve it for a wife who never came. The ghost people are the literal embodiment of the people who got stuck in that preservation project, still haunting the halls, still dressed in the hazmat suits that were supposed to protect them, still guarding a place that the thing it was supposed to protect has long since left. The franchise consistently uses its DLC content to explore dimensions of the post-apocalyptic condition that the main game's political frameworks cannot quite reach. Old World Blues is about the specific horror of intelligence disconnected from ethics and from embodied existence. Lonesome Road is about accountability and the weight of past actions that you cannot fully access. Dead Money is about the cost of attachment to things that are already gone. Point Lookout is about how regional history and old grievances persist into conditions that have made those grievances simultaneously more and less meaningful. Together, these explorations add up to a picture of the wasteland as a space full of unresolved past, of people and places and systems still operating from templates established before the world changed, still haunting the future with the unfinished business of what they were trying to do when the bombs fell. The ghost people are the most literal version of this, but the Brotherhood of Steel is also haunted, and the Enclave remnants are haunted, and every community that builds its identity around who it used to be rather than who it is becoming is haunted in the same way. The wasteland is full of ghosts, not just the ones that wander the Sierra Madre in hazmat suits, the ideology ghosts that haunt the Brotherhood's protocols, the guilt ghosts that the Master could not escape, the memory ghosts that Nick Valentine carries, the ambition ghosts that still hum through the machinery of the Lucky 38, Everywhere you go in the Fallout universe, you are walking through the consequences of things that were left unfinished, goals that were not achieved and means that were not reconciled, and relationships that were not fully resolved before the world changed and made the resolution impossible. Learning to live in that world, to build forward in a landscape full of unresolved, backward-facing grief, is what all the protagonists of the franchise are ultimately trying to do. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Always trying. Part 10, The Enclave, and who was actually running America. By the time the bombs fell, the United States government had become mostly decorative. The real power in the country had migrated into a shadow organization, an inner circle of the most powerful military, political, and corporate figures in America who had concluded that the existing structures of democratic governance were too slow, too visible, and too accountable to manage the kind of decisions that needed to be made in the final years before civilizational collapse. This organization called itself the Enclave. The Enclave is, in Fallout terms, essentially the deep state given physical form and a very nice oil rig to operate from. They were not evil in the way that implies cackling villainy. They were evil in the way that powerful people who have convinced themselves that their judgment is superior to everyone else's ethics become evil. Incrementally, with documentation, using the language of necessity and sacrifice and the greater good. The Enclave's connection to Vault Tech, which becomes clearer across the games, is one of the franchise's most important revelations. The Vault program was not a government welfare project. It was research infrastructure for the Enclave's post-war plans. When the Enclave looked at the geopolitical situation in the 2050s and 2060s and concluded that nuclear war was eventually inevitable, they did not try to prevent it. They began planning for what would come after it. The vaults were the mechanism for collecting the data they would need and the population they would eventually draw from to rebuild a world on their terms. The Enclave had its own shelters, separate from the vault system. The oil rig off the coast of California, which served as their primary headquarters in Fallout 2, was one of these. They also had facilities scattered across the country, including Raven Rock in the Capital Wasteland, and numerous smaller installations documented across Fallout 3 and subsequent games. These shelters were not experiments. They were designed to actually keep people safe, because the people inside them were the ones the Enclave considered worth saving. The Enclave's view of who qualified as human, in the most operationally relevant sense, was extremely narrow. After 200 years of post-war contamination, they had developed a position. The people who had survived on the surface were not really human anymore. Exposure to radiation, FEV in the atmosphere and water, and 2 centuries of mutation had changed them at the genetic level in ways the Enclave considered disqualifying. Super mutants were obviously inhuman. Ghouls were obviously inhuman. But even the apparently normal surface dwellers were contaminated enough in the Enclave's framework to be categorically different from the preserved pre-war human stock the Enclave itself had maintained. The logical conclusion of this position was genocide. If the surface population was not human, then eliminating it was not a crime. It was pest control, conducted in preparation for the repopulation of the surface by the Enclave and its carefully maintained gene pool. The FEV-based biological weapon that the Enclave in Fallout 2 was developing was designed to kill everything in the wasteland that had any mutation at all, which meant everything in the wasteland that was alive. Then the Enclave would come down from their platforms and rebuild civilization in their image, uncontaminated by 2 centuries of adaptive radiation. There is something almost admirable about the consistency of this vision, in the same way that there is something almost admirable about any system of thought that is internally logical even when its premises are catastrophically wrong. The Enclave had a plan, and it was coherent, and it would have worked if they had been able to execute it. The fact that the premises required you to define the survivors of the apocalypse as subhuman in order to make the elimination of them acceptable is the part that the Enclave's internal documents tend to glide past in careful, neutral language. The player characters of Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 dismantled the Enclave's plans in their respective games, though through very different means and with very different understanding of what they were doing. The Chosen One in Fallout 2 was directly confronting an organization that wanted to kill everyone they knew. The Lone Wanderer in Fallout 3 was navigating the ruins of a different Enclave chapter, one that had developed somewhat different priorities and methods under the leadership of Colonel Autumn, though the foundational arrogance about who qualified as human remained consistent. After Fallout 3, the Enclave as an organized institution was largely destroyed. What remained were remnants, small groups operating without coordination, some of whom had genuinely processed the failure of the Enclave's vision and were trying to figure out what a post-Enclave life looked like. The Enclave remnants in Fallout, New Vegas, a group of elderly veterans who had participated in the events of Fallout 2, are among the most interesting characters in the franchise, precisely because they are people who once believed completely in something that was monstrous and who have spent decades since then trying to decide what to do with that knowledge about themselves. Arcade Gannon, one of the optional companions in New Vegas, is the son of an Enclave veteran and grew up surrounded by the remnants of the organization. He is someone who carries the Enclave as an inheritance he did not choose and cannot entirely escape. His questline, Old World Blues in the context of finding the remnants and deciding what they should do, is one of the most carefully observed character portraits in the franchise. These people, old now, past the age of action, are asked to make one more decision about what they stand for. The Enclave's lasting impact on the Fallout universe is not primarily through direct action after Fallout 3. It is through the infrastructure they built, the ideologies they seeded, and the specific ways their particular brand of technocratic elitism keeps reappearing in organizations that would not define themselves as Enclave-aligned, but share the same fundamental belief that some people are more human than others, and that those who qualify as fully human should be making decisions for everyone else. The Institute, in Fallout 4, is not the Enclave, but it shares the belief that surface dwellers are essentially irrelevant to the real work of human advancement. The Brotherhood of Steel, in its more extreme Eastern chapters, shares the belief that the contaminated and the synthetic have a different and lesser status than the pure. These are the Enclave's ideas, drifting through the post-war world in new containers, attaching themselves to new institutions, producing the same outcomes from different premises. That is perhaps the most frightening thing the Enclave represents in Fallout's world. Not the oil rig, not the FEV-laced mutagen, not the power armor, and vertibirds. The most frightening thing is how naturally the ideas survived even after the institution that generated them was destroyed. Ideas do not require their origin to keep going. They just need to find new hosts. The specific ideology that justified the Enclave's position deserves examination beyond the broad strokes of its monstrousness, because understanding how it works is more useful than simply knowing it is wrong. The Enclave did not begin with genocide as a goal. They began with survivalism and ended with genocide as a logical implication of the survivalist premise once it was applied consistently enough. The founding premise was reasonable. In a world heading toward nuclear catastrophe, it made sense for some people to prepare more seriously than others. The Enclave's specific preparation was more thorough and more deliberate than what the Vault program offered, because the people in the Enclave had more information about what was coming and more resources to respond to it. They built better shelters. They maintained more comprehensive records. They preserved more pre-war knowledge and technology. By any survivalist metric, they succeeded where most other institutions failed. The problem that emerged over the following 2 centuries was that success in survivalism requires you to decide who the survivors are. The Enclave had already made that decision before the war, themselves and the people they chose to bring with them. The vaults were research infrastructure, not genuine salvation. The general American population was, from the Enclave's perspective, the study population rather than the preserved one. After the war, this distinction required ongoing maintenance. If the people on the surface were admitted to be fully human in the morally relevant sense, then the Enclave's decision not to save them, not to use its resources and knowledge to facilitate a broader survival, became a crime of omission so large as to be genuinely difficult to sit with. The easier psychological move, and the more convenient political one, was to maintain and deepen the distinction. The people on the surface were not really human, they were contaminated. They were something else. This was not just a description of their biological state. It was a conclusion that the Enclave needed to be true in order to avoid a particular accounting for what it had done and not done. By the time of Fallout 2, this conviction had calcified to the point where the Enclave's leadership could discuss the planned elimination of the surface population in the same register they would use to discuss pest control. Not enthusiastically. Not with visible cruelty. With the bland reasonableness of people who have had this conversation many times and have resolved the ethical dimensions to their satisfaction. That bland reasonableness is more disturbing than cruelty would be, because cruelty implies some recognition that something bad is being done. The Enclave's tone implies that the question of whether something bad is being done has been answered and the answer filed away. The Chosen One's destruction of the Enclave in Fallout 2 is one of the franchise's most cathartic moments, but the game is honest about what it does and does not resolve. The oil rig is gone. The central leadership is dead. The primary weapon is destroyed. But the ideas that animated the Enclave are not destroyed. You cannot destroy ideas with bullets. You can disrupt the institution that maintains and promulgates them, but the ideas themselves move on to new hosts, and the Fallout franchise documents that movement with the same even hand it brings to everything else. The most honest thing the franchise says about the Enclave is not in any confrontation with their leadership. It is in the moment at Acadia, when Dima asks whether you would know if you were a synth. The Enclave's fundamental error was not that they were wrong about the surface population's contamination. It is that they used that contamination as a basis for categorical judgment about moral worth, and then used that categorical judgment to eliminate the need for any further engagement with the question. Dima's question is an invitation to sit with the uncertainty, rather than resolve it by force, which is the specific move the Enclave was constitutionally unable to make. The Enclave remnants in New Vegas, as the oldest surviving members of the organization, have had decades to process what they participated in and where it led. The fact that Arcade Gannon, the son of an Enclave soldier, chose to spend his adult life providing free medical care in Freeside is the franchise's most precise statement about what the correct response to the Enclave's legacy looks like. Not atonement through spectacle, just the quiet, sustained work of being useful to the people the ideology you inherited had declared unworthy of consideration. Part 11. New Vegas, its endings, and what they say about humanity's future. The second battle of Hoover Dam is the endpoint of Fallout. New Vegas, and depending on who wins it, the American Southwest looks completely different afterward. The NCR wins and gains definitive control over the Mojave Wasteland, establishing the clearest and most durable forward momentum toward organized civilization in the western United States. The NCR is not a perfect institution. It is bureaucratic and sometimes corrupt and stretched so thin that it cannot adequately support all the territory it claims. Its relationship with the people it governs is transactional in ways that sometimes slide into exploitation, but it is recognizably a republic. It holds elections, it has laws that theoretically apply to everyone, it has the cultural infrastructure for holding itself accountable to standards it has publicly committed to, even when it fails to meet those standards. House wins and the Mojave becomes his technocratic kingdom, with the Strip as its gleaming heart and the Securitron army as his enforcement mechanism. The NCR is pushed back to California. Caesar's Legion is either destroyed or driven east to reform without their leader. New Vegas functions, perhaps better than it ever has, with power and water and security and the particular kind of order that comes from very competent, very ruthless management. The rest of the Mojave exists in House's shadow, which is either benevolent or not, depending on how House feels about any particular decision point. There is no mechanism to hold him accountable if he becomes less benevolent. Caesar's Legion wins and establishes something that the game is honest about calling slavery with better marketing. The Legion's social order is brutal, hierarchical, and specifically organized around the subjugation of women and the violent elimination of anyone who does not fit the mold of the soldier-citizen the Legion wants to produce. Caesar himself is an educated man who genuinely believes his vision is the only one capable of creating the stability that ended the cycle of civilizational collapse. He is wrong, but he is wrong in a way that has its own internal logic, and the game takes the effort of making that logic visible, rather than just making him cartoonishly evil. The player helps establish an independent New Vegas, and the Mojave is governed by the Courier and Yes Man, the wildcard AI who will assist with whatever the Courier decides. This is simultaneously the most optimistic and the most uncertain ending. No single faction dominates the region. The Courier's vision, whatever that was, shapes the direction of the community that emerges. Yes, Man's closing comment, that he intends to become a bit more assertive, is a gentle warning that the independent ending is not a solved problem. It is the beginning of a different problem, possibly better than what came before, but requiring its own sustained effort to maintain. The fan debates about which of these endings is best, most defensible, most realistic, most aligned with the values the game actually endorses, have never reached consensus. This is by design. Chris Avallone and the team at Obsidian built New Vegas specifically so that every faction had genuine strengths and genuine failures, so that reasonable people could look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. The NCR ending is the one with the clearest connection to the franchise's broader political optimism. The idea that human beings can build institutions worth inhabiting, that democracy and law and the collective project of governance are worth the effort even when they fail, that the failures are reason to improve the institution rather than abandon it. The choice to build recognizable civilization after the end of civilization is made by picking the NCR ending. But there is a critique of this that the game also makes, and it is honest. The NCR is the civilization that already failed once. The United States that ended in nuclear fire was also a republic. It also had elections and laws and theoretical accountability. It produced the Enclave and the Vaults and the FEV experiments and all the rest of it. Rebuilding the same institutional architecture and hoping it goes differently this time is either courageous or naive, depending on whether you think the problem was with the specific people in the specific system or with something more fundamental about the way that kind of power concentrates and corrupts. House's ending is the one for people who have decided that institutions cannot fix themselves, that the only solution to the failure of collective governance is individual excellence, and that finding the right individual and giving them unchecked authority is less dangerous than continuing to iterate on a system that keeps producing the same catastrophic results. This is an understandable conclusion to reach after 200 years of watching republics and empires and tribes all produce versions of the same violence. It is also, in the most fundamental sense, the argument that has historically been made by every authoritarian who ever existed. The Legion ending is the one the game itself seems least interested in endorsing, and it is the one that depends most heavily on accepting Caesar's own framing of his project, which is that stability and strength are the only values that matter, and that everything else is luxury. The game lets you reach this ending. It does not ask you to feel good about it. The independent ending is perhaps the most honest about the scale of what New Vegas is actually doing. It is the ending that says, we do not know what comes next, and the uncertainty is real, but the absence of imperial domination is worth the uncertainty. It is an ending built on the courier's specific character and choices, rather than on any faction's pre-existing ideology. Whatever it produces, it was chosen rather than inherited. The Fallout television series, when it eventually made its way to the Mojave, handled the question of which ending was canon by refusing to pick one. The showrunners described this as a fog of war approach. The events of the show make clear that the NCR is in serious decline, that New Vegas is in some state of upheaval, that House may or may not be operating in some form, but the specific path that led to that situation is deliberately kept ambiguous. Obsidian's original intent was for all the endings to have equal validity, and the show tried to honor that even while having to set its story somewhere specific. What the television series did do was confirm that the events of New Vegas happened, that the Second Battle of Hoover Dam took place, that a courier walked through the Mojave and made a decision at the end of it, and that the consequences of that decision are still echoing 15 years later. The specific nature of those consequences, which faction held what territory and for how long, remains the question. But the existential stakes of the original game, the fact that one person's choices at one specific moment shaped the direction of civilization for a generation, that much is affirmed. And that is the thing Fallout. New Vegas is finally saying underneath all the faction politics and the moral complexity and the extraordinarily dense lore, what individual people do matters. The courier was shot in the head and left for dead in the desert. They woke up in a doctor's house with no clear purpose and an enormous amount of open road in front of them. What they did with that situation changed the world. The game is not interested in telling you what change was best. It is interested in telling you that the change was real and that it was yours, and that the decision to make it was worth making. The specific choice the show made in handling New Vegas, keeping the outcome in fog of war, has a precedent in how the franchise itself has always handled its biggest questions. Fallout has historically been more interested in the questions its endings raise than in the endings themselves. The ending slides of Fallout 2 describe multiple possible futures for multiple communities across the game's map, and the futures described are all conditional on the chosen one's specific set of choices. None of them is presented as the true ending. All of them are presented as equally valid responses to the preceding events. Fallout New Vegas takes this further by making the political dimensions of its ending choices more explicit. The faction you support at the Second Battle of Hoover Dam is not just a personal preference, it is a political position. And the game, unusually, takes each political position seriously enough to make the strongest possible case for it, while also making the case for why it is insufficient. The NCR deserves to win. The NCR also represents the continuation of a system that has failed before. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the game trusts you to hold both at once. The theory that the franchise secretly endorses the independent New Vegas ending is the most persistent interpretive claim in the fan community. The evidence cited includes the fact that it is the hardest ending to achieve, requiring the most quests and the most careful navigation of multiple competing faction interests. Hard endings in games often encode authorial preference, the idea being that what required the most effort to build also reflects the most investment in what it means. The Yes Man route requires you to gather support across multiple factions, to deal with the Omertas and the White Glove Society and the followers of the Apocalypse and the Kings in Freeside and everyone else, in ways that are optional for the other endings. The independent ending is the only one that genuinely requires you to engage with the full political complexity of the Mojave. But the game also places Yes Man's warning about becoming more assertive in the independent ending specifically and not in the others. That warning is a reminder that the independent Vegas is not a solved problem. It is the beginning of a different problem. The Courier has made the political landscape different, has removed certain constraints and certain forces, but has not addressed the underlying conditions that made the region vulnerable to those forces in the first place. Yes, Man's warning is Obsidian being honest that their favorite ending is also the most uncertain one. The New California Republic's decline, as depicted in the television series, adds a dimension to the New Vegas question that the game could not have anticipated, but that retrospectively feels inevitable given the lore. The NCR was always stretched. It was always managing a territory larger than its resources comfortably supported. The specific blow shown in the television series, the destruction of Shady Sands, is the kind of event that a governmental structure operating at its limits might not be able to recover from. Whether the NCR situation in the show is the consequence of a specific New Vegas ending or just the natural trajectory of an overextended institution is part of the fog the showrunners chose to maintain. What the television series does add to the New Vegas conversation is a sense of time passing and consequences accumulating. The choices made in 2281 are not frozen. They continue to produce effects in the years after, in ways that interact with all the other forces shaping the region's development. The independence of New Vegas, if that is what the Courier chose, did not end the story. It created a new set of conditions. Conditions in which factions continued to operate and individuals continued to make decisions, and the world continued to change in the ways it always changes. Slowly, incompletely, with frequent backsliding, and occasionally in directions that surprise everyone involved. That is perhaps the most realistic thing about Fallout's political storytelling. It takes seriously the idea that political decisions have long consequences, and that those consequences are not linear. That what you build today will interact with what other people are building, and what the environment provides and what chance produces, and the result will not be what any individual planned, but something that emerged from all of those interactions. The Courier stood at Hoover Dam and made a choice. The world made several thousand other choices around that one. And 15 years later, the result is something that nobody could have fully predicted from where they stood on the dam. The theory that the game's creators had a preferred vision, even if they built all 4 endings to be navigable, shows up most clearly in the specific way they constructed the quest lines for each faction. The NCR questline is long and complex, and requires sustained engagement with the Republic's institutional reality in ways that reveal both its strengths and its failures. The House questline requires you to serve a specific vision and to grapple with the specific ways that vision subordinates everything to the judgment of one person. The Legion questline is shorter and requires you to believe things about historical progress and the utility of violence that the game's other content systematically undermines. The Independent questline requires you to be something that none of the other questlines require, genuinely curious about the Mojave's people and communities for their own sake, rather than for the faction's interests. You need to understand the Omertas because they are part of the strip's social ecology. You need to engage with the white gloves, because their specific pathology has implications for the broader community. You need to deal with the kings because Freeside's stability matters for reasons that go beyond any faction's strategic interests. The independent run is the run that most fully develops your understanding of the Mojave as a place, rather than as a theater of strategic operations. Whether that design choice reflects authorial preference, or just the structural requirements of a genuinely independent outcome, is debatable. An independent Vegas requires you to have relationships with all the relevant parties, because there is no single patron to handle things for you. That is a structural necessity, not necessarily an endorsement, but the specific people you meet in those extended engagements, the specific humanity the game develops through the optional content the other factions mostly allow you to skip, suggests that the designers found the full Mojave more interesting than any particular faction's interpretation of it. The question of what happened in the 15 years between New Vegas's events and the television series is one of the most generative gaps in the franchise's timeline. The NCR was apparently struck hard enough that its capital, Shady Sands, was destroyed in a way that severely compromised the Republic's ability to project power. The Brotherhood was present in the Mojave in ways that suggest they maintained or expanded their footprint there. The three families that ran the strip were apparently disrupted enough that the strip's 2,296 condition is substantially different from its 2,281 condition. None of these changes have clean explanations available from what the show has revealed so far. They are the products of 15 years of post-New Vegas history that we have not been shown, in a region that multiple factions were contesting with significant resources and genuine intensity. The Battle of Hoover Dam, whichever version of it became the actual historical event, set the conditions for 15 years of subsequent history that shaped everything the show depicts. Understanding what that history was, even partially, would tell us what the actual outcome of the Courier's choices was. The fog the showrunners maintained is deliberate and appropriate, but it also means that one of the franchise's most interesting unanswered questions remains unanswered. The Lucky 38, still lit at the end of Fallout Season 1 and the apparent destination of Hank McClane at the beginning of Season 2, represents the franchise doing something it does particularly well, using a single image as the focal point for an enormous amount of unresolved narrative tension. The light in the Lucky 38 is either Mr. House or something that operates in his name or something completely unexpected, and the meaning of Hank McClane walking toward it says something specific about where the television series thinks the Fallout universe's political center of gravity currently sits. What it says is that the pre-war order in some form is still trying to reassert itself. Hank McClane is a Vault-Tec executive. He is walking toward a pre-war industrialist who built his position on the premise that individual genius should direct civilizational development. Two survivors of the old world, each with their own version of the old world's agenda, drawn toward each other in the ruins. Whether what comes out of that meeting represents a continuation of the old world's patterns or a transformation of them is something the show has not yet answered, but the question it is raising is exactly the right one. Part 12. The mysteries that still have no clean answer. There are questions in the Fallout universe that have been debated since the first game shipped in 1997, and they are still being debated. Some of them have been clarified by later games. Some of them have been deliberately kept open, and some of them exist in a permanent state of productive uncertainty that the franchise has decided is actually more valuable than resolution would be. The question of what the future of the wasteland actually looks like is the big one. Every game in the franchise, and now the television series, is essentially asking what happens when people try to rebuild after the worst possible collapse. Do they repeat the mistakes? Do they find new ones? Is there something in human nature that makes violence and hierarchy and exploitation inevitable outcomes of any social organization at sufficient scale? Or is there something else, something more hopeful, that keeps persisting through all of it? The interesting thing about Fallout, as a franchise, is that it refuses to answer this definitively. The NCR, the best argument that civilization can be rebuilt, is perpetually strained and flawed. The Brotherhood of Steel, the argument that order and discipline can maintain something worth keeping, keeps sliding into the same authoritarianism it claims to oppose. The communities that spring up organically across the wasteland, the ones that look most like hope, are also the most fragile, the most easily destroyed by a single raider attack or a drought, or a faction that decides their land is more useful as a staging ground. And yet they keep trying. That is the thing. They keep trying. The settlement system in Fallout 4 is sometimes criticized for being clunky and poorly implemented as a game mechanic, but what it is expressing narratively is actually one of the franchise's most important points. People, given the choice, will build. They will gather resources and put up walls and try to make something that is safe enough for other people to come to. They will argue about how to do it and they will make bad decisions, and sometimes the whole thing will fall apart. But the impulse to build rather than to simply survive, to create rather than to just take, does not seem to go away no matter what the circumstances are. The question of whether synths are people has never been answered in the games, and seems designed to remain unanswered. The question of what happens to a ghoul's identity over 200 years has never been answered, and seems designed to remain a question. The question of what the Courier's true history was before the events of New Vegas has never been answered, and the designers made choices that suggest it was deliberately kept open, rather than accidentally left unresolved. There is also the matter of what happened to everything before the Fallout universe's divergence point. The world of Fallout split from our history somewhere in the 1950s, and the specific point of divergence is never clearly identified. This has generated an enormous amount of fan theorizing about which events in our actual history were changed, which technologies took different paths, and what those differences produced. The existence of fusion power and sophisticated robotics, alongside a cultural aesthetic frozen in the 1950s, suggests something deeply strange happened to the trajectory of American culture. A kind of technological progress that was deliberately directed away from the computer revolution we actually experienced, and toward a different set of priorities. Some theorists in the fan community have suggested that this represents a different resolution to the Cold War-era anxiety about scientific progress, where our world channeled its resources into information technology and, eventually, the internet. Fallout's world channeled them into energy production and physical automation. The result was a society that was extremely good at specific things, building massive robots and maintaining nuclear fusion, and that had completely different blind spots. No global communications network, no computing revolution in the way we experienced it, a political culture that remained frozen in the particular rigidity of the post-war American consensus. That rigidity might actually be part of the explanation for why the Great War happened in Fallout's timeline in a way it did not in ours. A society that is psychologically and institutionally frozen in 1950s, American nationalism that has never had its assumptions challenged by the cultural upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s, that has doubled down on the Cold War framework rather than eventually finding a way through it, might be exactly the kind of society that is constitutionally unable to step back from the brink when the brink arrives. Or it might just be that the specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments sent things one way rather than another, and the structural factors are retrospective explanations for what was actually just the contingency of individual choices under pressure. Fallout tends to believe both things at once, that systems create the conditions for disasters, and that disasters are also the products of specific people making specific decisions that could theoretically have gone differently. The mystery of Vault 77 and the one man and his puppets will probably never be resolved. That terminal entry exists, those few lines of text describing a man who is now alone with a crate of puppets in a sealed vault, and no further information has ever been provided. The community has speculated. Theories range from black comedy to genuine tragedy. Nobody has answered it, and given how long Bethesda has been aware of the attention it gets, the choice not to answer it feels deliberate. Some things are better as questions. The question of what happened on the morning of the 22nd of October 2077, the day before the bombs fell. For the ordinary person who had no access to vaults and no pre-war bunkers and no special preparation, is one the games approach through environmental storytelling, but never quite answer completely. Every skeleton in every ruined house is an answer to that question. Every pre-war home with a half-finished meal on the table, every child's bedroom with toys scattered on the floor, every car whose driver died trying to flee a city that was already gone. The wasteland is full of that specific morning, and every playthrough of every game is, in some sense, a visit to a museum of it. And underneath everything, underneath the faction politics and the mutant biology and the philosophical debates about consciousness and the question of who fired which missile first, there is the question the franchise has been asking since the very first title screen appeared, with its crumbling American iconography and the words, War. War never changes. The phrase is most often read as pessimistic, as a statement that humanity is condemned to repeat the same patterns indefinitely, that every civilization built on the ruins of the last one will eventually produce its own version of the same disaster. But there is another way to read it. If war never changes, and yet civilizations keep rebuilding anyway, keep planting crops and having children and making art and arguing about the best way to organize a community, then something else also never changes. The impulse to keep going. The decision to build something rather than to simply wither in the ruins. The wasteland is full of terrible things, but it is also full of people who got up this morning and tried to make things slightly better than they were yesterday. Doc Mitchell treating a stranger shot in the head. A ghoul who has been alive for 2 centuries and is still doing the work. A sole survivor who woke up from the longest sleep of their life and chose to keep moving. War never changes, but the people fighting it, for better and for worse, the people caught in it, the people trying to survive it, and sometimes the people trying to end it, keep changing. They adapt, they mutate, they rebuild, they make new things from the rubble of old things. And sometimes those new things are better, and sometimes they are worse. And the franchise never promises you which one you are getting. That is, in the end, the thing Fallout is actually about. Not the bombs, not the factions, not the radiation or the vaults or the question of whether synths have souls. It is about what you do after the worst thing that could happen has happened. It is about getting up. The wasteland is quiet now. The questions are still there, sitting in the dark somewhere between what we know and what we think we know, waiting for the next person to come along with a Pip-Boy and enough stubbornness to keep walking. Sleep well. Whatever you are carrying with you tonight, let it rest for a while. The theories will still be there when you wake up. The wasteland will still be there. And somewhere in it, someone is still building something worth having. War never changes. But tonight, at least, you do not have to fight it. If these stories kept you company tonight, it would mean a lot if you subscribed. There is so much more of this world left to explore, and it is better to explore it together. The final question the Fallout universe leaves open is also the most personal one. Not who fired first or what Vault-Tec was really building or whether synths are people. Those are the public questions, the ones with political and philosophical implications. The personal question is, what do you do with the knowledge? You have spent time with this world. You have read the terminal logs and heard the companion dialogue, and walked through the ruins and made choices that shaped outcomes. You know things about what produced the wasteland that most of the people in the wasteland do not know, because you have access to information from outside the fiction's information ecology. You have read the room, so to speak, in ways that the characters cannot. What the franchise has always wanted you to do with that position is not feel superior to the characters who do not have your information. It is to feel accountable. The knowledge of what went wrong is not satisfying if it is just trivia about a fictional world. It is supposed to reverberate the specific mechanisms of institutional failure, the specific patterns of how power concentrates, and how accountability degrades, and how ordinary functionality enables extraordinary harm, are real patterns. They are in the world outside the franchise, in systems and institutions and patterns of behavior that are not fictional. The Wasteland is a story about consequences, about what it looks like on the other side of a set of choices that were made by real beings with real intentions, some of whom wanted to do harm and many of whom thought they were doing good. The characters in the Wasteland are living in the consequences of decisions they did not make and mostly do not fully understand. Their struggle to build something decent in those conditions is not a metaphor for anything. It is what human beings do. It is what human beings have always done. The Fallout franchise does not offer comfort about this. It does not promise that the patterns will change, or that the next iteration will be better, or that the suffering has a purpose that justifies it. What it offers is something rarer and more honest. A detailed, patient, sometimes darkly funny portrait of people being people in the hardest possible circumstances and continuing to be worth something anyway. The ghoul who has been walking for 200 years and still extends a limited mercy to the people who surprise him with their honesty. The scientist who could not go through with the experiment. The man who woke up in a grave and decided to find out what happened next. These are small victories. They are not the solution to the pattern that produced the wasteland, but they are real and they are present in every corner of the franchise, and they are what the franchise believes constitutes the best argument for the species. Not the institutions, or the ideologies, or the factions with their competing visions of what humanity should become. The small, consistent, unnewsworthy decision to keep being decent even when decency is expensive. To keep building even when what you build is fragile. To keep trying. That is the theory underneath all the other theories. The one that explains why people keep returning to the wasteland, game after game, night after night. Not to be told that things will be fine. To be reminded that trying is worth it even when fine is not guaranteed. That is enough for tonight. There is something worth saying about the specific role that companions play across the Fallout franchise, because they are not just gameplay mechanics. They are the franchise's primary argument that individual relationships matter even when civilizations fail. Every major game in the series offers you companions, and every companion carries a story that would be worth a game on its own. The depth with which Fallout treats the people who travel with you is the depth with which the franchise treats individual human beings as ends rather than means. Boone, the sharpshooting NCR veteran in New Vegas, carries a specific guilt that has calcified into a life organized around the elimination of Legion forces. He cannot bring back his wife. He cannot undo what he paid someone to do to her. What he can do is continue moving forward with a rifle and a red beret and a willingness to be useful. And the game is honest that this is not healing. It is coping, and that coping is what you get to have when healing is no longer an option. Traveling with Boone is an education in the specific shape of survivor's guilt when it has had years to settle into a permanent posture. Veronica Santangelo, the Brotherhood scribe who travels with you in New Vegas, represents something the franchise rarely addresses directly: the experience of loving an institution that is failing. She knows the Brotherhood's problems in detail. She has been arguing for change internally for years without success. She loves the Brotherhood anyway, loves the people in it, loves the mission as she understands it, and cannot bring herself to leave even when the game gives her every reason to. When she finally has to make a choice about her relationship with the Brotherhood, the specificity of her grief, regardless of which way the player steers her, is one of the most emotionally precise moments in the series. EDE, the iBot courier companion who carries fragments of pre-war audio that nobody expected to find, is the franchise's reminder that history persists in objects as much as in people. The recordings inside EDE are a snapshot of a moment just before the war, people talking about plans they expected to carry out, concerns they expected to resolve, futures they did not know were already foreclosed. EDE does not understand what it carries. It just carries it, faithfully, across 2 centuries, waiting for someone who knows how to listen. Companions are also the device through which the franchise makes its strongest argument about the possibility of genuine relationships across the various divides the wasteland creates. Nick Valentine, a synth, can be your most trusted companion. Fox, a super mutant, can be your most loyal. Rex, a cybernetic dog, can be your most uncomplicated. The barriers that the wasteland's politics erect between people, the barriers that ideologies insist are necessary and permanent, dissolve in the specific context of sustained shared experience. You learn who someone is by traveling with them. The wasteland knows this. That is why the companions are always the most human thing in it, whatever they are made of. The last theory worth sitting with tonight is not about the lore, or the timeline, or the factions, or the technology. It is about why any of this resonates as deeply as it does. The Fallout universe is a horror show rendered in a specific aesthetic of golden retrofuturism, a world that wanted to be the 1950s forever and paid the price for that refusal to grow. The horror works because the beauty is genuine. The Vault Boy is genuinely charming. The mid-century architecture of the vaults is genuinely elegant. The music is genuinely wonderful. The life that was lost was genuinely worth living, and the people who lost it genuinely did not deserve what happened to them. That combination of something beautiful and something catastrophic occupying the same space is what makes the franchise unforgettable. It is not just dystopia, it is paradise failed. A world that had everything it needed to be something remarkable and chose, through accumulated small decisions and institutional failures and the specific cowardice of people who saw what was coming and did not act, to burn it all. The beauty of the pre-war world is not ironic decoration. It is the measure of what was lost, and therefore the measure of what the people in the wasteland are carrying forward when they choose to rebuild. They are not rebuilding a functional society from scratch. They are trying to recover something that was real, that existed, that was worth having, and that was destroyed not by inevitability but by choice. That is the thing the Fallout franchise knows that most post-apocalyptic fiction does not. The apocalypse was not inevitable. It was chosen by people who could have chosen differently, in conditions that made the wrong choice very easy and the right choice very hard, but conditions that were themselves created by prior choices and prior choices before that, all the way back to a specific moment when the pattern that led to the bombs was established and normalized. That knowledge, that it was chosen and could have been otherwise, is what makes the wasteland meaningful rather than merely bleak. It means that different choices, going forward, could produce different outcomes, not guarantee them. The wasteland offers no guarantees, but make them possible. And making them possible is all any individual can do, in the wasteland or anywhere else. That is the theory underneath everything else. The one that does not appear in any terminal log or any piece of environmental storytelling, but that animates all of it. Things can be different. They are not guaranteed to be, but they can be. And that is worth building toward, one careful choice at a time. For as long as you have the energy and the will. The Wanderer sets the Pip-Boy to quiet mode and keeps walking. Sleep well, Wanderer.